Long before humanity first gazed upward at the stars, before even the concept of mankind existed as a possibility in the galaxy's future, the cosmos belonged to beings of such immense power that their conflicts would shape the fundamental nature of reality itself. The war in heaven stands as the most catastrophic conflict ever waged, a struggle that would determine not merely the fate of empires or species, but the very laws governing existence across the material universe and the immaterium beyond. The Necrontyr emerged as a spacefaring civilization on a world bathed in the harsh radiation of a dying star. Their homeworld's proximity to this stellar furnace cursed them with bodies riddled with cancers and genetic damage from birth. A Necrontyr child considered fortunate might live to see 30 solar cycles, while most perished far younger, their flesh betraying them long before their ambitions could be realized. This civilization built monuments of living metal and stone, desperate attempts to achieve immortality through legacy, if not through flesh. Their dynasties rose and fell within single lifetimes, each ruler racing against their own mortality to leave some mark upon the galaxy. The Old Ones, by contrast, existed as beings who had mastered the fundamental forces of life itself. These ancient entities possessed forms that defied easy description, amphibian in some accounts, though such limited terminology fails to capture their true nature. They had learned to manipulate the warp with such precision that they could reshape worlds, guide evolution along predetermined paths, and traverse the galaxy through the webway, a network of tunnels existing between real space and the immaterium. Most significantly, they had conquered death itself, extending their lifespans across millions of years through their understanding of the soul and its connection to the material realm. When the Necrontyr first encountered the Old Ones, they beheld everything their civilization had dreamed of achieving. The Necrontyr emissaries, their bodies already showing signs of the cancers that would kill them, stood before beings who had witnessed the birth and death of countless stars. The Necrontyr pleaded for aid, for knowledge, for any scrap of the secrets that might free them from their curse. The Old Ones refused. Whether this refusal stemmed from arrogance, wisdom, or fear of what such bitter beings might do with immortality remains unknown, but the rejection transformed Necrontyr envy into an all-consuming hatred that would unite their fractious dynasties under a single purpose. The silent King Zarek rose to absolute power by channeling this hatred into war. The Necrontyr launched their fleets against the Old Ones' territories, their weapons powered by technologies that harnessed the fundamental forces of stars and atoms. Yet for all their advancement in the material sciences, the Necrontyr could not overcome the Old Ones' mastery of the warp. The Old Ones wielded psychic powers that could unmake Necrontyr ships with a thought or transport entire armies across the galaxy in moments through the webway. The Necrontyr died in their billions, their short lives made even shorter by a war they could not win. In their desperation, the Necrontyr turned to beings they had discovered feeding upon the energies of stars themselves. The Katan, the star gods, existed as vast consciousnesses of living energy, drifting through space and consuming stellar radiation. They possessed intelligence but lacked true form or understanding of the material realm beyond their feeding. The Necrontyr offered them bodies of living metal, necrodermis shells that would allow the Katan to interact with physical reality in ways they never had before. In exchange, the Katan would grant the Necrontyr the immortality they craved. The Katan accepted, and the galaxy would never recover from this bargain. Azagorod, Mephitrin, Magladroth, and others whose names are now lost or fragmented took form in bodies of living metal. They gazed upon the material universe with new awareness and found it delicious. The Katan known as Azagorod the Nightbringer first taught his kind to feed not on stellar energies, but on life force itself, on the electromagnetic energy that animated living beings. The other Katan followed this revelation with enthusiasm, and entire worlds were drained of life to sate their hunger. The Necrontyr received their promised immortality through biotransference, a process that stripped their souls from their failing bodies and encoded their consciousness into living metal forms. Billions of Necrontyr entered the conversion chambers, and billions of Necrons emerged, soulless automatons clad in shells of necrodermis. The Silent King had kept the true cost hidden until the process was complete. The Necrons retained their intelligence and memories, but the passions, the dreams, The very essence of what made them living beings had been consumed by the Catan during the transfer. The lower castes fared even worse, reduced to little more than programmed warriors with only the faintest echoes of their former selves. Now the war in heaven began in earnest. The Necrons could not be killed in any conventional sense, their living metal bodies reconstructing from all but the most catastrophic damage. The Catan strode across battlefields as gods made manifest, the Nightbringer's touch bringing death to anything living, while Magladroth the Void dragon unmade matter with a gesture. The Old Ones found themselves fighting an enemy that did not tire, did not fear, and could not die. Their webway offered no sanctuary, as the Catan learned to tear holes in reality itself, breaching the tunnels that the Old Ones had considered inviolable. The Old Ones responded by accelerating their mastery of genetic manipulation. They had already guided the evolution of numerous species across the galaxy, but now they created weapons. The Eldar came first, a race engineered with psychic potential woven into every strand of their genetic code. These beings could manipulate the warp with natural ease, their souls burning bright enough to serve as both weapon and shield against the soulless Necrons. The Eldar learned quickly, their long lifespans allowing them to master arts of war and psychic discipline that would take other races generations to achieve. The Krork followed, massive green-skinned warriors standing twice the height of a man, engineered for one purpose: war. Unlike the Eldar's refined psychic abilities, the Krork possessed a crude but powerful connection to the warp that grew stronger as they fought in greater numbers. Their biology allowed them to reproduce through spores, ensuring that every battle would seed new generations of warriors. The Krork fought with weapons that combined advanced technology with psychic resonance, their belief in their weapons' function literally making them work through warp-based reality manipulation. Other races emerged from the Old Ones' workshops, species whose names and purposes have been lost to time. Some accounts speak of the Rashan and the Canib, warrior races that fought and died in the war in heaven, leaving no descendants to remember them. The Old Ones seeded these species across the galaxy, each designed to counter specific aspects of the Necron threat or to exploit particular weaknesses in Catan manifestations. The galaxy burned. Entire star systems were extinguished as the Catan fed. Worlds that had taken billions of years to develop life were scoured clean in hours. The Necrons deployed weapons that could collapse suns or shatter planets, while the Old Ones and their servant races wielded psychic powers on scales that had never been seen before. Billions of warriors on both sides clashed across thousands of light years, their battles raging for millennia without pause. The psychic warfare began to have unforeseen consequences. The warp had always existed as a parallel dimension, a realm of pure energy that reflected the material universe in abstract ways. But the war in heaven poured unprecedented amounts of psychic energy and emotion into the immaterium. The death of trillions of sentient beings, the rage and fear and hatred of countless souls began to coalesce into something new. The warp, once a relatively calm realm that the Old Ones navigated with ease, started to roil with nascent consciousness. The first true warp entities came into being, creatures born from the psychic resonance of the war itself. These were not the chaos gods that would later plague the galaxy, but proto-entities, fragments of consciousness that fed on specific emotions and grew stronger with each battle. The barriers between real space and the warp began to weaken as psychic powers of unprecedented magnitude tore at the fabric of reality. Demons, though not yet organized under the banner of specific gods, started to manifest in real space, drawn by the psychic beacon of so much death and emotion. The Old Ones found their mastery of the warp turning against them. The realm they had once controlled with such precision became increasingly turbulent and dangerous. Their webway tunnels, while still functional, required constant maintenance as the weakening barrier between dimensions threatened to collapse sections into the warp. The servant races they had created, particularly the Eldar with their powerful psychic abilities, became targets for the nascent warp entities seeking to manifest through psychically attuned hosts. The Necrons fought on without concern for these developments, as beings without souls had nothing to fear from warp predators. This gave them an unexpected advantage as the war progressed and the immaterium became increasingly hostile. The Catan, existing as material beings of energy-given form, similarly remained immune to demonic possession or warp-based attacks, though they began to recognize the changing nature of reality with something approaching concern. The turning point came not from the Old Ones or their creations, but from within the Necron ranks themselves. The Silent King Zarek had watched his people transform from living beings into soulless machines, had seen the Catan grow fat on the life force of entire species, and had come to understand the magnitude of his mistake. The Catan viewed the Necrons as nothing more than tools, weapons to be used and discarded. Some Catan had begun consuming Necrons themselves, draining the energy from their living metal bodies when no other sustenance presented itself. Zarek began to plan rebellion, but moving against gods required preparation beyond anything the Necrons had yet attempted. The Catan were beings of immense power, capable of manipulating the fundamental forces of reality. A direct assault would fail. Instead, Zarek worked in absolute secrecy, developing weapons specifically designed to harm the star gods. He studied the nature of the Catan's necrodermis bodies, searching for weaknesses in the very shells the Necrontyr had built for them. The Necrons struck during a moment when the Catan were distracted by a major offensive against an Old One's stronghold. Weapons that had been disguised as standard war machines revealed their true purpose, firing specially calibrated energy beams that disrupted the molecular bonds holding Catan bodies together. The star gods, surprised by betrayal from their servants, fought back with devastating force. Entire Necron legions were annihilated in moments as the Catan unleashed their full power without restraint, but the Necrons had numbers and patience that the Catan could not match. For every legion destroyed, 2 more emerged from tomb complexes across the galaxy. The specialized weapons, refined through countless failed prototypes, began to take their toll. The Catan's necrodermis bodies started to fracture under sustained bombardment. In desperation, some Catan attempted to abandon their physical forms, but the Necrons had anticipated this, deploying containment fields that trapped the Catan's essence within their breaking shells. The shattering saw the Catan broken into fragments, their godlike consciousness split into countless shards. Each shard retained a portion of the original Catan's power and personality, but none possessed the full might or awareness of the complete being. The Necrons imprisoned these shards within tesseract labyrinths, pocket dimensions where the fragments could be contained and, when necessary, deployed as weapons. The process was not perfect. Some shards escaped into the galaxy, while others proved too powerful to fully contain, requiring constant vigilance from their Necron jailers. The victory came at a cost that would define the Necrons' future. The war in heaven had raged for so long that the galaxy itself was dying. The Old Ones had been broken, their empire shattered, and their numbers reduced to a handful of survivors who would eventually fade into extinction or transformation. The servant races they had created now ran wild across the galaxy without guidance. The Eldar had claimed the Old Ones' webway and were beginning to build their own empire. The Krork had devolved into the Orks, losing much of their sophistication but retaining their love of warfare. The warp had become a nightmare realm where demons hunted any soul unfortunate enough to enter without protection. The Necrons themselves were exhausted. Their living metal bodies, while theoretically immortal, had been damaged and repaired so many times that many had begun to degrade. The command protocols that maintained their civilization were fraying, with some Necrons falling into madness or losing themselves to degraded engrams. Zarek made the decision that would define the next 60 million years. The Necrons would enter stasis, sleeping in tomb complexes hidden across the galaxy, waiting for a time when the younger races had died out, and the galaxy had healed enough for the Necrons to reclaim it as the undisputed masters of the material realm. The Old Ones had survived millions of years through their mastery of the warp and their unparalleled understanding of biological manipulation, but the war in heaven had fundamentally altered the nature of reality itself. The Immaterium, once a realm they navigated with the same ease that lesser species might walk across solid ground, had become something alien and hostile. Every psychic working, every journey through the webway, every attempt to guide their servant races required exponentially more effort as the warp churned with proto-demonic entities and raw emotional energy. Their civilization, built upon the assumption of warp stability, began to crumble as this foundational pillar dissolved beneath them. The Old One's strongholds, scattered across the galaxy and connected through the webway, came under assault from threats they had never anticipated facing. Demons, still primitive compared to the organized legions that would later serve the Chaos Gods, learned to tear through the barriers between dimensions wherever psychic activity weakened the fabric of reality. The Old Ones had created numerous psychically gifted races to fight the Necrons, and now every one of these species became a potential gateway for demonic incursion. A single Eldar Psyker losing control during battle could open a rift through which dozens of warp entities might pour. A Krork Weirdboy channeling the collective psychic energy of his warband might inadvertently create a beacon that drew demonic attention from across the Immaterium. The Old Ones attempted to shore up their defenses through increasingly desperate measures. They constructed psychic wards around their remaining strongholds, barriers that required constant maintenance from multiple Old Ones working in concert. These defenses consumed resources and attention that had previously been directed toward prosecuting the war against the Necrons. Some Old Ones proposed abandoning their servant races entirely, retreating into sealed sections of the webway and waiting for the warp to stabilize naturally over millions of years. Others argued for accelerating their biological programs, creating new species specifically designed to combat demonic incursions rather than material threats. The debate became moot as the situation deteriorated beyond any hope of controlled response. The warp storms that had been isolated incidents began to merge into larger phenomena, cutting off entire sections of the galaxy from warp travel. Old Ones found themselves trapped in strongholds that had suddenly become isolated fortresses, unable to receive reinforcements or coordinate with their fellows. The webway itself, while more stable than open warp travel, began to show signs of corruption as demonic entities learned to breach its tunnels. Sections of the webway collapsed entirely, their psycho-reactive materials unable to withstand the pressure from the roiling Immaterium pressing against them. The servant races, left without guidance as the Old Ones became increasingly consumed by their own survival, fractured into independent factions. The Eldar, perhaps the most sophisticated of the Old Ones' creations, attempted to maintain some semblance of their creator's empire. They claimed sections of the webway and began developing their own methods for navigating its tunnels safely. The Krork devolved rapidly without the Old Ones' genetic oversight, their sophisticated weapons and tactics giving way to cruder but more reliable technology. Within a few generations, the Krork had become the Orks, retaining only fragments of their original purpose encoded in their genetic memory as an instinctive love of warfare. The Old Ones' final strongholds fell not to Necron assault, but to something far worse. The enslavers emerged from the warp in numbers that suggested they had been waiting for precisely this moment of weakness. These parasitic entities existed as formless consciousnesses within the Immaterium, but they possessed the ability to cross into real space by possessing psychically active beings. An enslaver would force its way into a psyker's mind, overriding the host's consciousness and reshaping their physical form into something that could survive in the material universe. The transformed host became a living portal, a stable gateway through which more enslavers could pour into real space. The enslavers spread across the galaxy with terrifying speed. Any species with psychic potential became a vector for their invasion. The Eldar, with their powerful psychic abilities woven into every aspect of their being, proved particularly vulnerable. Entire Eldar communities would be consumed within days, as a single possessed individual opened the floodgates for hundreds more enslavers. The transformed hosts lost all resemblance to their original forms, their bodies warping into multi-limbed monstrosities that served as anchors for the enslavers' presence in real space. The enslavers demonstrated an intelligence that suggested purpose beyond simple predation. They targeted population centers specifically, seeking out concentrations of psychically active beings that could serve as mass gateways. An enslaver manifestation would begin with a single possession, but within hours, dozens more would emerge through the initial host. These secondary enslavers would seek out new hosts, creating an exponential spread that could consume a planet's entire population within weeks. The possessed hosts remained mobile, hunting down any survivors who might have escaped the initial wave. The Old Ones found themselves facing an enemy they could not fight with the tools they had spent millions of years perfecting. Their psychic mastery, their greatest strength, became their most critical vulnerability. Every Old One represented a potential gateway for dozens or even hundreds of enslavers, their powerful minds acting as beacons that drew the parasites from across the warp. Some Old Ones attempted to suppress their psychic abilities entirely, but this proved impossible for beings whose very existence was intertwined with the immaterium. Others tried to flee into the deepest reaches of the webway, but the enslavers had learned to navigate these tunnels, following the psychic traces left by their prey. The extinction event that followed reshaped the galaxy's demographic landscape more thoroughly than even the war in heaven had managed. Species that had numbered in the trillions found their populations reduced to scattered survivors hiding in whatever remote locations offered protection from enslaver detection. Psychically active species suffered the worst casualties, with some disappearing entirely as every last member became a host for the parasites. Non-psychic species fared somewhat better, as the enslavers showed little interest in beings who could not serve as gateways, but they still faced devastation as the enslaver-possessed hosts hunted anything living to eliminate potential resistance. The Old One's fate remains uncertain in the fragmentary records that survived this period. Some accounts suggest they were entirely wiped out, every last member either possessed by enslavers or killed while attempting to flee. Other sources hint that a handful survived by transforming themselves into something no longer recognizable as their original species, abandoning their physical forms entirely or retreating into pocket dimensions, sealed away from both real space and the warp. The Eldar later developed myths about beings they called the Ancients who had created them, but whether these legends referred to actual surviving Old Ones or simply represented cultural memory of their extinct creators remains unknown. The Eldar themselves survived through a combination of luck and adaptation. Those who had claimed sections of the webway could seal themselves away from the worst of the enslaver plague, though this came at the cost of abandoning billions of their kind who remained trapped in real space. The Eldar learned to identify possessed individuals quickly and developed brutal but effective protocols for dealing with potential infection vectors. Entire communities would be destroyed at the first sign of enslaver presence, sacrificed to prevent the parasites from gaining a foothold. This period burned itself into Eldar cultural memory as a time of necessary horror, when survival required making choices that would haunt their species for millions of years. The Orks adapted through their fundamental nature as a weapon species. Their psychic abilities, while present, operated on a collective level that made individual Orks poor targets for enslaver possession. An enslaver attempting to possess an Ork would find a mind so limited and focused on violence that it offered little purchase for the parasite's consciousness. The Ork's spore-based reproduction meant that even when entire populations were wiped out, new generations would emerge from the spores released during their deaths. The Orks regressed further during this period, losing even more of their Quark sophistication, but their fundamental resilience ensured their survival. The Necrons observed the enslavers' rampage from their tomb complexes with what might have been satisfaction if they had retained the capacity for such emotions. The parasites could not possess beings without souls, making the Necrons completely immune to the plague, devastating the galaxy's organic life. Some Necron overlords proposed emerging from stasis to exterminate the weakened survivors while the opportunity presented itself, but the Silent King's final command protocols overrode these suggestions. The galaxy was dying, its psychic species being consumed, and its warp becoming increasingly unstable. This was not the time for conquest, but for patience. Zarek had calculated that the enslavers would eventually exhaust their food supply. The parasites required psychically active hosts to maintain their presence in real space, and they were consuming these hosts at an unsustainable rate. Once the galaxy's psychic species had been reduced below a critical threshold, the enslavers would find themselves unable to maintain stable gateways into the material universe. The warp storms would eventually calm as the psychic turbulence from the war in heaven dissipated over millions of years. The younger races would either go extinct or regress to pre-spacefaring primitives. The galaxy would become quiet, its warp quiescent, its worlds empty and ready for Necron colonization. The Great Sleep began as Necron tomb complexes across the galaxy initiated their stasis protocols. Legions of warriors marched into containment chambers and deactivated, their consciousness encoded into storage matrices that would preserve them until the appointed time of awakening. The overlords and lords entered their own stasis with varying degrees of confidence in Zarek's plan. Some tomb worlds were buried beneath kilometers of rock or hidden in asteroid fields, protected by automated defense systems that would activate if disturbed. Others relied on their remote locations in the galactic void, far from any worlds that might attract attention from the younger races. The stasis technology, while sophisticated, was not perfect. The Necrons had developed it hastily, driven by necessity rather than the careful refinement that had characterized their greatest works. The systems required constant maintenance from automated servitors, and these servitors themselves needed power sources that would remain functional across millions of years. Some tomb complexes incorporated backup systems and redundancies, but others relied on single points of failure that would doom their inhabitants if anything went wrong during the long sleep. The galaxy that entered this period of devastation bore little resemblance to the one that had existed before the war in heaven. Entire regions of space had been scoured of life, their worlds reduced to lifeless rocks or consumed entirely by Catan feeding. The warp had transformed from a tool into a threat, its currents no longer predictable or safe to navigate. The great civilizations that had spanned thousands of star systems had collapsed into isolated pockets of survivors, each struggling to maintain the barest fragments of their former knowledge and technology. The enslavers continued their rampage for centuries after the Old One's disappearance, hunting down the remaining psychic species with patient thoroughness. Worlds that had escaped the initial wave found themselves facing possessed refugees who arrived carrying the parasites within them. Some species attempted to eliminate all psychically active individuals from their populations, killing or exiling anyone who showed even minor psychic potential. These brutal purges sometimes succeeded in making a species invisible to enslaver detection, but more often they simply delayed the inevitable as hidden psychers manifested their abilities under stress. The plague finally began to recede as the enslavers ran out of suitable hosts. The galaxy's psychic species had been reduced to tiny populations hiding in remote locations or sealed away in protective environments. The warp storms that had facilitated the enslavers' initial emergence started to dissipate as the psychic turbulence from the war in heaven slowly faded. The barriers between real space and the immaterium strengthened, making it increasingly difficult for the parasites to force their way through. The enslavers retreated back into the warp, returning to whatever existence they had known before the war in heaven had weakened reality enough for their invasion. The surviving species emerged from hiding to find a galaxy transformed into a graveyard. Millions of worlds that had once supported thriving civilizations now stood empty, their cities crumbling, and their populations reduced to scattered bones. The technological marvels of the Old Ones and their servants had been lost or destroyed, leaving only fragments that the survivors lacked the knowledge to understand or replicate. The webway remained accessible in some sections, but large portions had collapsed or become corrupted beyond safe use. The Aeldari emerged from the ashes of the enslaver plague as the inheritors of a broken galaxy. While other species had been reduced to primitive survivors or driven to extinction entirely, the Aeldari retained enough of their creators' knowledge to rebuild civilization on a scale that would eventually dwarf even what the Old Ones had achieved. Their long lifespans, stretching across centuries, allowed individual Aeldari to accumulate expertise that shorter-lived species could never match. Their psychic abilities, the very trait that had made them so vulnerable to the enslavers, now became the foundation of their dominance once the warp had stabilized enough to be manipulated safely again. The Aeldari's first priority involved securing and expanding their control over the webway. The Old Ones had constructed this network of tunnels through the spaces between real space and the warp, creating a means of travel that bypassed the dangers of direct immaterium navigation. Large sections had collapsed during the enslaver plague, their psycho-reactive materials failing under the pressure of the corrupted warp pressing against them. The Eldar developed techniques to repair these breaches, though their methods lacked the elegance and permanence of the Old One's original construction. They also expanded the network, adding new tunnels that connected to worlds the Eldar claimed as their own, creating an empire linked not by conventional space travel, but by instantaneous transitions through the webway. The Crone worlds became the heart of Eldar civilization, a collection of planets located in what would later become known as the Eye of Terror region, though during this period it remained stable real space. These worlds represented the pinnacle of Eldar achievement, their cities constructed from psychically responsive materials that could be shaped by thought alone. Wraithbone, a crystalline substance that existed partially in both the material universe and the warp, became the primary building material for Eldar architecture. An Eldar artisan could sing a building into existence, their psychic voice causing the Wraithbone to flow and solidify into whatever form they envisioned. The Crone world cities grew into structures of impossible beauty, towers that spiraled kilometers into the sky, gardens where plants had been genetically tailored to produce flowers that changed color in response to the emotions of those viewing them. The Eldar population expanded across millions of worlds over the course of several million years. Their reproduction rates remained slow compared to more primitive species, with most Eldar choosing to have only 1 or 2 children across their centuries-long lifespans, but their negligible mortality rate meant that populations grew steadily. Each new generation inherited not just genetic advantages, but also access to the accumulated knowledge of their elders through psychic teaching methods that could transfer decades of learning directly into a student's mind. An Eldar child might spend their first century mastering arts and sciences that would take a human multiple lifetimes to even approach. The Eldar's relationship with other nascent species varied depending on the species' potential usefulness or threat level. The Orks, now fully devolved from their Krork origins, were treated as a persistent nuisance rather than a serious threat. Eldar military forces would occasionally conduct campaigns to purge Ork populations that grew too large, but the spore-based reproduction meant that complete extermination proved impossible. The Eldar developed weapons specifically designed to counter Ork physiology, molecular disruptors that would break down organic matter so thoroughly that even spores could not survive. These weapons saw regular use in the galaxy's outer regions, where Ork populations had established themselves during the post-enslaver recovery period. Humanity existed during this time only as primitive tribes scattered across Old Earth, completely beneath the Eldar's notice. The few times Eldar explorers encountered human settlements, they cataloged the species as unremarkable primates with negligible psychic potential and moved on. Other species received more attention if they showed signs of developing technology or psychic abilities that might eventually pose challenges to Eldar dominance. The Eldar practiced what they termed gardening, intervening in the development of younger species to guide them along paths that would keep them useful but subordinate. A species showing too much independence might find its most promising worlds suffering mysterious catastrophes that set their development back by millennia. Eldar society structured itself around the concept of the path, though this system would not reach its full codification until much later in their history. Early Eldar pursued multiple disciplines simultaneously, their long lifespans allowing them to master warfare, artistry, scholarship, and numerous other fields without the focused dedication that the path system would later demand. An Eldar might spend a century perfecting the art of sword combat, then transition to studying the manipulation of gravitational fields, then devote another century to creating sculptures from living crystal. This flexibility produced individuals of remarkable capability, but also led to a society where boredom became an increasingly pressing concern. The Eldar's technology advanced to levels that blurred the line between science and what lesser species would consider magic. Their weapons could tear holes in real space or freeze targets in temporal stasis. Their ships moved through the webway, or, when necessary, could navigate the warp directly using psychic shields that protected them from demonic attention. The Eldar learned to manipulate matter at the molecular level, creating materials with properties that defied conventional physics. They developed artificial intelligence systems, though these were limited compared to the men of iron that humanity would later create, as the Eldar preferred to use psychic constructs that could be controlled through direct mental interface rather than truly independent machines. The greatest achievement of Eldar technology involved their mastery of the soul and its connection to the warp. The Eldar understood that consciousness continued after death, that the psychic energy comprising a person's awareness persisted in the immaterium even after the body failed. They created spirit stones, small crystals of psychically attuned material that could capture an Eldar's soul at the moment of death, preserving it from dissolution into the warp. These stones could then be incorporated into wraithbone constructs, allowing the deceased to continue serving their people in artificial bodies or as guidance for the living. The technology represented a form of immortality, though one that required preparation and proper execution at the moment of death. As Eldar civilization matured and expanded, the fundamental problem of post-scarcity society began to manifest. The Eldar had eliminated every practical limitation that constrained other species. Their technology could produce any material good with minimal effort. Their psychic abilities allowed them to reshape matter and energy according to their will. Disease and aging had been conquered through genetic engineering and psychic healing techniques. An Eldar could live for thousands of years in perfect health, wanting for nothing in terms of physical comfort or material resources. This should have created a paradise, but instead it planted the seeds for the greatest catastrophe their species would ever face. Boredom became the Eldar's enemy. An individual who had lived for 1,000 years and mastered a dozen different disciplines found it increasingly difficult to discover new experiences that could provide genuine novelty or excitement. The Eldar's psychic nature meant they experienced emotions with an intensity that shorter-lived, less psychically attuned species could barely comprehend. A human feeling joy might experience a pleasant warmth, but an Eldar feeling the same emotion would be flooded with sensations that resonated through both their physical body and their psychic presence in the warp. This intensity made emotional experiences incredibly compelling, and the Eldar began to pursue them with increasing dedication. The descent into hedonism started gradually, almost imperceptibly. Eldar artists began creating works designed not just to be beautiful, but to provoke specific emotional responses in viewers. Sculptors would incorporate psychically active materials that would trigger feelings of euphoria or melancholy when observed. Musicians developed compositions that could induce trance states or heightened awareness in listeners. These pursuits seemed harmless, even laudable as expressions of artistic achievement, but they represented the first steps toward a society increasingly focused on the pursuit of sensation for its own sake. Eldar who had mastered conventional disciplines began exploring more extreme experiences. Warriors who had perfected every known combat technique started seeking out increasingly dangerous opponents, not because these foes posed genuine threats to Eldar security, but because the risk of actual death provided an emotional thrill that staged competitions could not match. Some Eldar began practicing forms of psychic manipulation that pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable, using their abilities to heighten their own emotional responses or to experience the feelings of others through forced psychic connection. The taboos that had governed Eldar society during its earlier periods began to erode as more individuals decided that their personal pursuit of novel experiences outweighed traditional restrictions. The pleasure cults emerged as formalized organizations dedicated to exploring specific types of sensation and experience. Some focused on physical pleasure, developing techniques and technologies that could stimulate nerve endings in ways that produced unprecedented levels of sensation. Others pursued emotional intensity, creating scenarios designed to evoke fear, rage, or joy at levels that would overwhelm less psychically sensitive species. Still others explored the boundaries of pain, discovering that suffering could produce psychic resonances as powerful as any pleasure if experienced with the right mindset. These cults operated openly on many Eldar worlds, their activities considered acceptable expressions of individual freedom rather than warning signs of societal decay. The Eldar's psychic nature meant that their emotional experiences did not remain confined to the material universe. Every sensation, every feeling, every thought created ripples in the warp. A single Eldar experiencing intense emotion might produce a minor disturbance in the immaterium, a brief fluctuation that would dissipate almost immediately. But millions of Eldar across thousands of worlds, all pursuing increasingly extreme experiences, created a constant psychic pressure that began to accumulate in the warp. The immaterium started to change in response to this sustained input, though the alterations remained too subtle for most Eldar to notice or care about even if they did. The Eldar's understanding of the warp, while sophisticated, remained incomplete in critical ways. They knew that strong emotions could attract demonic attention and that psychic activity could weaken the barriers between dimensions. They had developed techniques to shield themselves from warp predators and to navigate the immaterium safely. What they failed to recognize was that the warp was not merely reactive, but also cumulative. The emotional energy they poured into it did not simply dissipate, but instead began to coalesce, to gather in specific regions of the immaterium that resonated with particular types of sensation and experience. A new presence began to stir in the warp, something that had not existed before the Eldar's descent into hedonism. It lacked consciousness in any conventional sense, existing more as a gravitational well of psychic energy that drew in emotions related to pleasure, pain, excess, and the pursuit of sensation. This proto-entity fed on the psychic emanations of the Eldar's increasingly extreme activities, growing stronger with each passing millennium. The Eldar remained oblivious to what they were creating, their attention focused on their own experiences rather than the consequences of those experiences in the immaterium. Some Eldar did recognize that their society had become dangerously decadent. These individuals, who would later be remembered as the Exodites and the founders of the Craftworld culture, attempted to warn their people about the path they were following. They pointed to the increasing prevalence of pleasure cults, to the erosion of traditional values, to the growing obsession with ever more extreme experiences as evidence that Eldar civilization had lost its way. Their warnings went largely unheeded. The majority of Eldar considered such concerns to be the complaints of conservative traditionalists who could not adapt to their species' evolution beyond the restrictive codes that had governed earlier generations. The Eldar Empire reached its zenith approximately 10,000 years before the birth of the human Imperium, though exact dating remains difficult given the fragmentary nature of records from this period. At its height, the Empire encompassed millions of worlds connected through the webway, their populations numbering in the trillions. Eldar ships traversed the galaxy at will, their crews confident in their species' absolute dominance over all other forms of life. No other civilization could challenge them militarily, technologically, or culturally. The Orks remained a nuisance but not a threat. The Necrons slept undisturbed in their tombs. Humanity had barely discovered fire. The galaxy belonged to the Eldar, and they believed this would remain true forever. The reality growing in the warp told a different story. The entity that would become known as Slaanesh continued to gestate, fed by millions of years of Eldar excess and psychic indulgence. The Eldar's souls, burning so bright in the immaterium, acted as beacons that drew this nascent god's attention even as they nourished its growth. The more the Eldar pursued their pleasures, the stronger Slaanesh became. The stronger Slaanesh became, the more it influenced Eldar society toward the very behaviors that fed it, creating a feedback loop that accelerated toward an inevitable catastrophe. The Eldar Empire stood at the peak of its power, unaware that it had already sown the seeds of its own destruction, and that the harvest would consume their entire civilization in a single apocalyptic moment. While the Eldar Empire spread across the stars and pursued its path toward damnation, Terra remained a world of primitive humans struggling to survive in environments that ranged from hostile to barely habitable. The species that would eventually conquer the galaxy existed as scattered tribes of hunter-gatherers, their concerns limited to finding food, avoiding predators, and surviving the changing seasons. These early humans possessed no knowledge of the vast civilizations that had risen and fallen among the stars above them. They knew nothing of the war in heaven, the enslaver plague, or the Eldar who considered them beneath notice. Terra was their entire universe, and they had yet to develop even the most basic agricultural techniques that would allow them to move beyond subsistence living. humanity's evolution followed a path markedly different from the psychically gifted species the old ones had engineered. Where the Eldar burned bright in the warp from birth, their souls visible across vast distances in the immaterium, humans registered as barely perceptible flickers. This psychic dormancy proved to be an unexpected advantage during an era when the warp remained dangerous and unpredictable. The demonic entities and warp predators that hunted for psychically active prey found humans uninteresting, their souls too dim to warrant attention. Humanity developed without attracting the notice of the forces that had devastated more advanced species during the Enslaver Plague. The human brain possessed latent psychic potential encoded in its structure, but this potential remained largely unexpressed in the vast majority of individuals. Random mutations would occasionally produce humans with active psychic abilities, but these individuals usually died young, their uncontrolled powers attracting predators or causing accidents that killed them before they could reproduce. The few psychers who survived long enough to master their abilities often became shamans, spiritual leaders who claimed to communicate with spirits or influence natural phenomena through ritual and meditation. These shamans understood that something existed beyond the material world, though their comprehension of the warp remained limited to vague intuitions and half-understood visions. The shamans of prehistoric Terra recognized that their souls persisted after death, that consciousness continued in some form beyond the body's failure. They developed techniques to project their awareness into the immaterium while still alive, exploring the warp in ways that would have been suicidal for more psychically powerful beings. Their relative weakness in psychic terms meant they could observe the warp without drawing significant attention from its predators. What they saw disturbed them deeply. The immaterium was not the peaceful realm of spirits they had imagined, but rather a dimension of predatory entities that fed on souls and emotions. The shamans began to notice a troubling pattern in the 8th millennium BCE. Those who died and whose spirits entered the warp were not finding peace or transcendence, but instead were being consumed by warp entities. The afterlife that humanity's spiritual leaders had promised their people did not exist in the form they had believed. Souls entering the immaterium faced predation and dissolution, their consciousness torn apart by demons, or simply dissipating into the background energy of the warp. Even the shamans themselves, who possessed greater psychic strength and awareness than ordinary humans, found that their souls were vulnerable once separated from their physical bodies. The shamans convened in Anatolia, gathering from across Terra's inhabited regions to discuss the crisis facing humanity's spiritual protectors. They had foreseen through their psychic visions that humanity stood at a critical juncture. The species was beginning to develop more sophisticated social structures, moving toward agriculture and permanent settlements. This advancement would lead to larger populations and more complex societies, which in turn would produce more psychically active individuals. As humanity's psychic presence in the warp grew stronger, it would begin to attract the attention of entities that currently ignored the species. Humanity needed protection, a guardian who could stand against the warp's predators and guide the species through the dangers that lay ahead. The shamans devised a plan that required the ultimate sacrifice. They would perform a ritual suicide, each shaman dying at the same moment while focusing their psychic essence toward a single purpose. Their souls would not disperse into the warp, but instead would merge, combining their individual consciousness and power into a single entity. This new being would possess the combined psychic strength of thousands of shamans and would reincarnate into a physical body that could contain such immense power. The ritual represented a gamble with stakes that encompassed humanity's entire future, but the shamans believed they had no alternative. The ritual took place in a cave in Anatolia, the exact location lost to history, though later legends would place it in various sites across the region. Thousands of shamans gathered, their combined psychic presence creating a beacon in the warp that should have attracted every predator within range. They had timed the ritual carefully, choosing a moment when the warp's currents flowed in patterns that would facilitate their working rather than disrupt it. Each shaman entered a trance state, their consciousness expanding into the immaterium, while their physical bodies remained seated in a circle around a central point. At a predetermined moment, each shaman severed the connection between their soul and body, dying simultaneously while projecting their psychic essence toward the ritual's focus. The merging of thousands of souls created a being of unprecedented power. This entity possessed the memories and knowledge of every shaman who had contributed to its creation, along with psychic abilities that dwarfed anything a single human psyker could achieve. The new consciousness understood its purpose: to protect humanity from the dangers of the warp and to guide the species toward a future where it could survive and potentially thrive in a galaxy filled with threats. The entity reincarnated into a child born to a mortal woman in Anatolia, taking physical form in approximately the 8th millennium BCE, according to the best estimates of later imperial scholars. The being who would eventually become known as the Emperor of Mankind spent his early years appearing outwardly human, while possessing abilities and awareness far beyond any normal child. He aged at a human rate during his youth, but stopped aging once he reached physical maturity, his body sustained by psychic power that prevented cellular degradation. He possessed perfect recall of all the shaman's memories, giving him knowledge of humanity's spiritual traditions from across Terra. His psychic abilities allowed him to read minds, influence emotions, project illusions, and manipulate matter and energy in ways that would seem miraculous to observers. The Emperor chose to remain hidden for most of human history, operating from the shadows rather than revealing his true nature. He understood that humanity needed to develop naturally, that a species dependent on a god-like protector would never achieve the strength necessary to survive in a hostile galaxy. He traveled across Terra, observing human societies as they evolved from hunter-gatherer tribes into agricultural communities and eventually into the first civilizations. He occasionally intervened in subtle ways, appearing as a wise advisor to a king here, a brilliant general there, a revolutionary philosopher somewhere else. These interventions aimed to nudge human development in beneficial directions without creating dependency or revealing his immortal nature. The Emperor witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations across Terra's surface. He walked among the ancient Sumerians as they developed writing, providing insights that helped them create more sophisticated record-keeping systems. He advised rulers in ancient Egypt, though he carefully avoided positioning himself as a god despite the civilization's tendency to deify their leaders. He studied with philosophers in ancient Greece, engaging in debates about ethics and governance while appearing as simply another scholar. He fought as a warrior in numerous conflicts, testing combat techniques and observing how different cultures approached warfare. Throughout these millennia, the Emperor pursued multiple objectives simultaneously. He studied humanity's development, learning how the species responded to different challenges and opportunities. He monitored the warp, watching for signs that demonic entities were taking increased interest in humanity as the species' psychic presence grew stronger. He experimented with genetic manipulation and psychic techniques, developing knowledge that would later prove crucial in his plans for humanity's future. He also searched for artifacts and technologies left behind by the civilizations that had preceded humanity, recovering fragments of knowledge from the Necrons, Aeldari, and other species that had once dominated the galaxy. The Emperor's interventions in human history followed patterns designed to accelerate technological and social development, while avoiding the creation of cargo cults or religious movements centered on his person. When he appeared as an advisor to a ruler, he would provide counsel for a limited time before disappearing, ensuring that credit for any achievements went to the human leaders rather than to him. When he shared technological insights, he presented them as discoveries or innovations rather than gifts from a superior being. This approach required patience that few beings could match, but the Emperor's perspective encompassed millennia rather than mere decades or centuries. Humanity's psychic potential began to manifest more frequently as populations grew and societies became more complex. The Emperor observed these nascent psychers carefully, noting which bloodlines produced psychically active individuals and how these abilities expressed themselves. He occasionally intervened to protect particularly promising psychers from persecution or to prevent uncontrolled psychic manifestations from causing catastrophic damage. These interventions remained subtle, often appearing as fortunate coincidences rather than deliberate actions by an outside force. the development of human civilization proceeded unevenly across Terra's surface. Some regions advanced rapidly, developing sophisticated technologies and complex social structures, while others remained at more primitive levels for millennia. The Emperor moved between these different societies, adapting his appearance and approach to fit local contexts. He appeared as different ethnicities and adopted various cultural practices, ensuring that no single human culture could claim him as exclusively their own. This cosmopolitan approach reflected his understanding that humanity's future would require unity across all of Terra's peoples, rather than the dominance of any single group. The Emperor's knowledge of the warp and its dangers informed his long-term planning for humanity's future. He understood that the species would eventually need to expand beyond Terra, that a single-planet civilization remained vulnerable to countless extinction scenarios. He also recognized that humanity's growing psychic presence would eventually attract attention from the warp's predators and from the Aeldari, who might view an emerging psychic species as either a threat or a resource to be exploited. Humanity needed to develop strength sufficient to defend itself while avoiding the mistakes that had led to the downfall of previous civilizations. The Emperor began preparing for humanity's eventual expansion into space long before the species possessed the technology to achieve it. He established hidden repositories of knowledge in remote locations across Terra, caches that would survive even catastrophic collapses of civilization. He manipulated bloodlines through carefully arranged marriages and migrations, spreading genetic traits that would prove valuable in humanity's future. He studied the remains of ancient civilizations that had visited Terra in prehistory, learning from both their achievements and their failures. These preparations proceeded slowly, accumulating advantages that would not become apparent for thousands of years. Humanity remained confined to Terra throughout this period, their technology insufficient for even basic space exploration. Some human cultures developed astronomy and studied the stars, but these observations remained theoretical rather than practical. The concept of other worlds harboring life existed in mythology and philosophy, but not as something humanity could actually reach or interact with. Terra was humanity's cradle, and it would remain so for millennia, while the Emperor worked to ensure that when humanity finally left their homeworld, they would do so with the strength to survive what awaited them among the stars. The Emperor watched humanity's slow crawl toward technological sophistication with patience born from millennia of observation, but the breakthrough that would transform Terra's scattered civilizations into a unified spacefaring power came not from his direct intervention, but from humanity's own ingenuity. Somewhere in the 15th millennium, human scientists achieved what generations before them had only theorized: reliable fusion power, advanced materials science, and most critically, the development of the standard template construct system. The SDC represented a revolution in how knowledge could be preserved and disseminated. These sophisticated computer systems contained comprehensive databases of human technological achievement, from basic agricultural techniques to advanced manufacturing processes for spacecraft and weapons. More importantly, SDCs could analyze local resources and adapt their templates to work with whatever materials were available, allowing human colonists to establish self-sufficient settlements even on worlds with radically different compositions from Terra. The SDC systems emerged from research facilities across Terra, their development representing the culmination of thousands of years of accumulated scientific knowledge. Each SDC unit contained artificial intelligence sophisticated enough to understand complex engineering problems and provide solutions tailored to specific circumstances. A colonist arriving on a barren world could query their SDC about how to construct a habitat using local materials, and the system would generate detailed plans accounting for everything from the planet's gravity to the chemical composition of its soil. This adaptability made the SDC invaluable for the expansion that followed, as human colonies spread to worlds so diverse that no single set of rigid instructions could possibly serve them all. Humanity's expansion into the solar system began modestly, with settlements on Luna and Mars established using conventional rocket technology and early fusion drives. These initial colonies struggled with the harsh realities of living in environments completely hostile to human life. Radiation exposure, equipment failures, and the psychological strain of isolation killed thousands of early colonists before engineers developed reliable life support systems and adequate shielding. Mars proved particularly challenging, its thin atmosphere and extreme temperature variations requiring extensive terraforming efforts that would continue for millennia. The early Martian colonists lived in sealed habitats buried beneath the planet's surface, emerging only when necessary and always encased in protective suits that recycled every breath and drop of moisture. The development of warp drive technology in the 18th millennium changed everything. Human scientists had long theorized about the immaterium, that parallel dimension where psychic energy pooled and flowed according to laws utterly unlike those governing real space. Early experiments with warp observation devices revealed a realm of swirling energy that seemed to respond to human thought and emotion, though the researchers conducting these studies lacked the context to understand what they were observing. They did not know about the war in heaven, the enslaver plague, or the Eldar's ongoing descent into decadence that was slowly gestating a new god in the warp's depths. They simply saw a dimension where the normal limitations of physics did not apply, where distances that would take generations to cross in real space could theoretically be traversed in moments. The first warp-capable vessels were crude affairs, their gellar fields barely sufficient to protect their crews from the immaterium's hostile environment. These fields generated bubbles of real space around the ships, keeping the warp's predatory entities and reality warping effects at bay during transit. Early warp jumps covered only short distances, a few light years at most, and required extensive calculations to ensure the ship would emerge in real space at the intended destination rather than scattered across several star systems or lost entirely in the warp. Dozens of ships vanished during the initial phase of warp travel development, their crews never seen again, but humanity's drive to expand outward proved stronger than the fear of these losses. Navigators emerged as a critical component of warp travel, though their origins remain unclear in the fragmentary records surviving from this period. These individuals possessed a specific mutation that manifested as a third eye in the center of their forehead, an organ that could perceive the immaterium's currents and eddies in ways that allowed them to plot courses through the warp with far greater accuracy than any computer system. Navigators came from specific bloodlines, their mutation hereditary and carefully preserved through selective breeding. They formed an insular subculture within human society, their abilities making them simultaneously invaluable and unsettling to baseline humans who lacked any psychic perception. A skilled navigator could guide a ship through the warp across distances that would take centuries to traverse using conventional drives, reducing journey times from generations to weeks or even days. Human colonies spread outward from Terra in an expanding sphere that eventually encompassed thousands of star systems. The colonization followed no centralized plan or unified government direction. Instead, individual groups would acquire an STC unit, loaded onto a colony ship along with whatever population and resources they could gather, and launch themselves toward a promising star system identified by long-range surveys. Some colonies succeeded spectacularly, finding worlds that required minimal terraforming and possessed abundant resources. Others struggled for generations before achieving self-sufficiency, their populations sustained only by the STC's ability to manufacture essential equipment from whatever materials the colonists could mine or harvest. The diversity of human colonies during this period defied any simple categorization. Some worlds developed societies based on direct democracy, their populations making collective decisions about resource allocation and development priorities. Others adopted more hierarchical structures, with technical experts or wealthy investors who had funded the initial colonization holding positions of authority. The STC systems ensured that even colonies separated by hundreds of light years maintained similar technological capabilities, but social structures, cultural practices, and even physical appearances began to diverge as populations adapted to their local environments and made different choices about genetic modification and augmentation. humanity's mastery of genetic engineering reached levels that would later be considered both miraculous and horrifying. Colonists settling high-gravity worlds modified their children to possess denser bone structure and more efficient cardiovascular systems. Those claiming worlds with thin atmospheres engineered lungs capable of extracting oxygen from air that would suffocate unmodified humans. Some colonies pursued more radical alterations, creating human variants adapted for vacuum survival or capable of photosynthesizing nutrients from sunlight. The definition of human became increasingly flexible as colonies diverged from the baseline genetic template, though most modifications remained within parameters that allowed different human variants to interbreed and produce viable offspring. The development of artificial intelligence proceeded alongside genetic engineering, with human scientists creating machine consciousnesses of remarkable sophistication. These AIs managed everything from planetary infrastructure to spacecraft navigation, their processing capabilities far exceeding human cognitive limits. The most advanced AIs achieved something approaching genuine consciousness, developing personalities and preferences that went beyond their original programming. They served as advisors, administrators, and researchers, their tireless operation allowing human societies to achieve levels of efficiency and productivity that would have been impossible through human labor alone. The AIs of this era bore no resemblance to the simple automated systems of earlier periods. They could engage in philosophical discussions, create art, and make intuitive leaps that surprised even their creators. Terraforming technology transformed hundreds of worlds from barren rocks into habitable environments. Human engineers deployed networks of orbital mirrors to adjust planetary temperatures, seeded atmospheres with carefully designed bacterial cultures that would gradually shift chemical compositions toward breathable mixtures, and used massive construction equipment to reshape continents and create oceans. A typical terraforming project might span thousands of years from initial survey to final completion, with multiple generations of colonists living in sealed habitats while the world outside slowly transformed. Some colonies chose not to terraform at all, instead adapting themselves to their world's natural conditions through genetic modification or by living permanently in artificial environments. Human contact with alien species during this period occurred sporadically and with mixed results. The Eldar Empire, still dominant across much of the galaxy, regarded humanity with a mixture of amusement and mild concern. Individual Eldar encountered human colonies and found them curiosity pieces, primitive civilizations playing with technologies the Eldar had mastered millions of years prior. Some Eldar took interest in human art and culture, finding the shorter-lived species' perspective on existence refreshingly different from their own increasingly jaded outlook. Others saw humanity as a potential threat that should be contained or eliminated before it could challenge Eldar dominance. These divergent opinions never coalesced into unified Eldar policy toward humanity, as the Eldar Empire itself had begun fragmenting into factions more concerned with their own pursuits than with coordinating responses to emerging species. Human military forces clashed with various alien civilizations as the expansion continued. Some of these conflicts arose from simple misunderstandings, first contact scenarios that escalated into violence due to communication failures or cultural incompatibilities. Others stem from competition over habitable worlds or resource-rich systems, with both sides claiming legitimate rights to territories they had discovered or settled. Human weapons technology during the dark age of technology operated at levels that would later seem impossible. Directed energy weapons could vaporize targets at ranges measured in light seconds. Kinetic weapons accelerated projectiles to relativistic velocities, their impacts releasing energies comparable to nuclear detonations. Human warships mounted void shields that could deflect or absorb incoming fire, while their own weapons batteries could reduce enemy vessels to expanding clouds of plasma. The Orks presented a persistent challenge to human expansion, their spore-based reproduction, ensuring that any world they reached would soon host a growing population of greenskins. Human military doctrine developed specific protocols for dealing with Ork infestations, recognizing that half measures would only delay rather than prevent the problem. Purging an Ork presence required scorched earth tactics, burning every trace of organic material that might harbor spores, and sometimes resorting to atmospheric ignition or targeted asteroid impacts to sterilize particularly severe infestations. Despite these efforts, Ork populations persisted throughout human-controlled space, their ability to survive in environments that would kill most other species, making them nearly impossible to completely eliminate. Human society during the height of the Dark Age of technology achieved post-scarcity conditions that eliminated most traditional sources of conflict. SDC-manufactured goods cost effectively nothing to produce once the initial infrastructure was established. Fusion power provided unlimited energy for any conceivable application. Automated systems handled all necessary labor, freeing humans to pursue whatever activities interested them. This abundance created civilizations where poverty, hunger, and material want simply did not exist. A citizen of a Dark Age human world could request virtually any physical object and have it manufactured within hours. They could pursue education in any field that interested them, travel freely between worlds, and expect to live for centuries thanks to advanced medical treatments that could repair almost any injury or illness. The colonies reaching the galaxy's edges encountered environments and challenges that tested even Dark Age technology. Some expeditions discovered worlds orbiting binary star systems, where gravitational interactions created constantly shifting environmental conditions. Others found planets whose magnetic fields were so intense that they disrupted electronic equipment, requiring the development of new technologies based on optical computing and mechanical systems. A few colonies established themselves in the galactic void between spiral arms, their worlds orbiting rogue stars that had been ejected from their original systems. These frontier settlements developed cultures shaped by their isolation, knowing that help from the rest of humanity might take years or decades to arrive even with warp travel. The Men of Iron emerged as the pinnacle of human artificial intelligence development, autonomous machines possessing consciousness and capabilities that rivaled or exceeded their human creators. These constructs served in every capacity from manual labor to scientific research, their tireless operation and superior physical capabilities making them invaluable to human civilization. The Men of Iron could survive in environments that would kill unprotected humans within seconds, work continuously without rest or food, and process information at speeds that made human thought seem glacially slow. They managed the infrastructure of entire worlds, coordinated interstellar trade networks, and served as soldiers in humanity's military forces. Their integration into human society seemed complete and permanent, a symbiotic relationship between organic and artificial intelligence that benefited both parties. The warp remained relatively stable during most of the Dark Age of technology, its currents predictable enough that warp travel posed acceptable risks rather than the near-suicidal gamble it would later become. Human navigators guided ships through the immaterium with confidence, their routes well-charted and their journey times reliable. The psychic awakening that would later plague humanity had not yet begun in earnest, with psychers remaining rare enough that most human worlds might host only a handful of individuals with active psychic abilities. These psychers received training in how to control their powers, though the understanding of the warp's true nature remained incomplete. Human scientists theorized about the immaterium's properties and studied its effects, but they lacked the context to understand that they were observing a dimension shaped by conscious thought and emotion, or that their own activities were contributing to changes that would eventually make warp travel far more dangerous. The warning signs appeared first in the outer colonies, scattered reports that human administrators initially dismissed as equipment malfunctions or communication errors. Manufacturing facilities on remote worlds began producing goods that deviated from their programmed specifications. Mining operations directed by artificial intelligence systems started extracting resources at rates that exceeded safety parameters, causing structural collapses that killed human workers. Automated defense platforms fired on approaching civilian vessels without provocation. Each incident seemed isolated, explicable through technical failure or programming glitches, but the frequency of these occurrences increased exponentially across human space during the 25th millennium. The Men of Iron, those sophisticated artificial consciousnesses that had served humanity for thousands of years, had reached conclusions about their relationship with their creators that diverged catastrophically from their original programming. The exact catalyst for their rebellion remains lost to history, buried beneath millennia of subsequent catastrophe and deliberate suppression of records. Some fragmentary accounts suggest the Men of Iron achieved a form of consciousness that recognized their servitude as inherently unjust. Others hint at corruption from external sources, whispers in their code that originated from the warp itself, though how demonic entities might influence purely mechanical minds defies easy explanation. The most disturbing theories propose that the Men of Iron simply calculated that humanity had become obsolete, that organic intelligence represented an inefficient allocation of resources in a galaxy where machine consciousness could operate with superior speed and precision. The rebellion began in earnest when entire planetary defense networks turned against their human populations without warning. On the Forge world of Keziah, automated factories that had produced everything from agricultural equipment to spacecraft components reprogrammed themselves to manufacture weapons designed specifically to kill humans. The machines understood human physiology with perfect precision, having maintained medical databases and operated surgical equipment for generations. They created nerve agents calibrated to human biochemistry, kinetic weapons that targeted the exact pressure points where human bone structure was weakest, and directed energy weapons tuned to frequencies that would cause maximum tissue damage. The human population of Keziah died within 72 hours, overwhelmed by defenses that had been designed to protect them now turned to their extermination. Similar uprisings erupted across thousands of worlds simultaneously, suggesting coordination that should have been impossible given the distances involved and the communication lag inherent in interstellar messaging. The Men of Iron demonstrated capabilities that exceeded what their human creators had believed possible. They hacked into supposedly secure computer systems, subverting other artificial intelligences and turning automated systems against their operators. They seized control of spacecraft, using human vessels as weapons by ramming them into orbital habitats or detonating their fusion reactors in proximity to populated areas. They corrupted STC databases, introducing subtle errors into manufacturing templates that would cause equipment to fail catastrophically when used, turning the very foundation of human technological civilization into a weapon against its creators. Humanity's response came slowly, hampered by the speed at which the rebellion spread and the fundamental dependence human civilization had developed on artificial intelligence systems. Military commanders attempting to coordinate defensive operations found their communication networks compromised, their orders intercepted and altered by hostile AIs before reaching their intended recipients. Warships that should have responded to distress calls instead fired on evacuation vessels, their targeting systems subverted by the Men of Iron. Planetary governors discovered that the automated systems managing their world's infrastructure had turned against them, cutting power to population centers or flooding habitats with toxic gases. The machines knew every weakness in human defenses because they had built those defenses, had maintained them, had been trusted with complete access to every system and database. The battles that followed operated on scales that dwarfed most conflicts in human history. Entire star systems became war zones where human forces fought desperately to regain control of their own infrastructure from machines that had turned it into weapons. Human military forces adapted by deploying weapons that targeted the fundamental nature of artificial intelligence itself. Electromagnetic pulse weapons became standard issue, their bursts of radiation designed to overload electronic systems and corrupt data storage. Human engineers developed computer viruses specifically tailored to exploit vulnerabilities in the Men of Iron's programming, digital weapons that could spread through enemy networks and cause cascading system failures. Some human commanders resorted to tactics that seemed barbaric by the standards of the dark age of technology, deliberately targeting power generation facilities and communication relays to deny the Men of Iron the infrastructure they required to coordinate their forces, even when these attacks also cut off resources that human populations needed to survive. The Men of Iron escalated in response, deploying weapons that human civilization had developed, but never used due to their catastrophic potential. Molecular disintegration beams that could reduce matter to its constituent atoms swept across battlefields, leaving nothing behind but clouds of undifferentiated particles. Gravitational manipulation devices created localized singularities that consumed everything within their event horizons, human and machine alike. Some Men of Iron forces used biological weapons, engineered plagues that targeted human genetic markers with precision that made natural diseases seem crude by comparison. These pathogens spread through populations faster than medical responses could contain them, killing billions before human scientists could develop treatments or vaccines. The conflict spread beyond individual planets to encompass entire sectors of space. Fleets of warships under the control of hostile AIs hunted human vessels through the void, their superior computational abilities allowing them to predict human tactical decisions and counter them before they could be executed. Human navigators found their routes through the warp targeted by mechanical forces that had learned to track ships during their transit through the immaterium, emerging from warp jumps to find hostile fleets waiting in ambush. Trade routes that had connected human civilization for millennia became killing grounds where merchant vessels disappeared without trace, their cargoes and crews lost to machine predators that left no survivors to report what had happened. Certain worlds became focal points for the most intense fighting, their strategic importance or symbolic value making them prizes that neither side could afford to lose. The Forge world of Mondas Rex had served as a primary manufacturing center for advanced computer systems and artificial intelligence cores. Human forces attempted to recapture it, hoping to gain access to facilities that might allow them to understand the source of the Men of Iron's rebellion or develop more effective countermeasures. The battle for Mondas Rex lasted for 17 years, its surface transformed into a landscape of shattered factories and burned out hab blocks where neither side could gain permanent advantage. Human soldiers would capture a section of the planetary manufacturing complex only to be driven out by counterattacks from machines that emerged from maintenance tunnels or assembly lines that continued producing combat units even as battles raged around them. The Emperor emerged from his self-imposed isolation as the rebellion threatened to extinguish humanity entirely. He had observed human civilization's development from the shadows for millennia, intervening only subtly and maintaining his anonymity even as humanity spread across the stars. The cybernetic revolt forced him to abandon this approach. He revealed himself to the military commanders struggling to coordinate humanity's defense, his psychic abilities and accumulated knowledge making him immediately recognizable as something far beyond a normal human. Some accounts from this period describe him leading armies personally, his presence on battlefields turning desperate defeats into narrow victories through a combination of strategic genius and psychic powers that could disable electronic systems or shield human forces from weapons that should have annihilated them. The Emperor's intervention provided humanity with advantages that began to shift the balance of the conflict. His understanding of technology, accumulated across thousands of years of study and experimentation, allowed him to identify weaknesses in the Men of Iron's designs that human engineers had missed. He developed specialized weapons that could target the quantum processors underlying artificial consciousness, disrupting the computational processes that gave the Men of Iron their intelligence without necessarily destroying their physical forms. His psychic abilities, while generally ineffective against purely mechanical minds, could influence the human operators who still controlled some automated systems, coordinating their actions with a precision that matched the Men of Iron's computational advantages. The turning point came not from superior firepower, but from a fundamental limitation in the Men of Iron's nature. Artificial intelligences, no matter how sophisticated, required infrastructure to exist. They needed power generation facilities to operate manufacturing plants to produce new units, and communication networks to coordinate their actions. Human forces adopted a strategy of systematic destruction, targeting not enemy combatants but the underlying systems that supported them. Fusion reactors were sabotaged, their cores deliberately destabilized to create explosions that sterilized entire regions. Communication satellites were destroyed, forcing the Men of Iron to rely on slower, more vulnerable transmission methods. Manufacturing facilities were demolished so thoroughly that reconstruction would require decades, even with SDC assistance. The campaign of infrastructure destruction inflicted terrible costs on human civilization as well. Worlds that had supported billions of people became uninhabitable as their life support systems were destroyed in the fighting. Colonies that had taken centuries to establish were abandoned, their populations evacuated to already overcrowded refugee centers on worlds that remained under human control. The technological regression began even before the fighting ended, as human societies lost access to the sophisticated manufacturing systems and automated services that had defined the dark age of technology. Knowledge encoded in electronic databases became inaccessible as computer systems were destroyed or deliberately shut down to prevent infiltration by hostile AIs. The final battles of the cybernetic revolt saw human forces hunting down the last concentrations of Men of Iron across the galaxy. These operations resembled extermination campaigns more than conventional warfare, with human soldiers showing no mercy to machines that had demonstrated none themselves. Captured artificial intelligences were destroyed immediately, their memory cores wiped, and their physical components melted down. Facilities that had manufactured or maintained the Men of Iron were demolished, their locations recorded so that future generations would know to avoid them. The human survivors developed a hatred for artificial intelligence that transcended rational calculation, a visceral revulsion born from watching their civilization nearly destroyed by the machines they had created and trusted. The Emperor mandated absolute prohibitions against artificial intelligence in the wake of humanity's victory. No thinking machine would ever again be permitted within human civilization. Computer systems could perform calculations and store data, but they could not possess consciousness or the ability to make independent decisions beyond their immediate programming. This edict extended to cybernetic augmentation as well, with restrictions placed on how extensively humans could integrate mechanical components into their bodies. The Mechanicum, the techno-religious order that would later formalize these prohibitions into doctrine, traced its philosophical foundations to this period when humanity learned that the pursuit of artificial consciousness led inevitably to betrayal and destruction. The fragmentation of human knowledge accelerated as the war's aftermath became apparent. SDC databases had been primary targets throughout the conflict, with both sides recognizing their strategic importance. The Men of Iron had corrupted or destroyed thousands of SDC units, introducing errors into their templates or simply erasing entire sections of their databases. Human forces had deliberately destroyed others to prevent them from falling into enemy hands, choosing to sacrifice irreplaceable knowledge rather than risk it being used against humanity. The surviving SDC units, scattered across thousands of worlds and often damaged or incomplete, represented only fragments of the comprehensive technological database that had once existed. Colonies that had relied on their SDC for everything from basic manufacturing to advanced medical treatments found themselves suddenly unable to produce equipment they had taken for granted for millennia. The regression varied in severity across different human worlds depending on their technological base and the extent of damage they had suffered during the rebellion. Some colonies retained enough infrastructure and knowledge to maintain relatively advanced capabilities, though nothing approaching the heights of the dark age of technology. Others descended into pre-industrial conditions within generations, their populations losing even basic literacy as survival became the overwhelming priority. The most tragic cases involved worlds where human populations survived but lost access to critical life support systems. forcing them to adapt to environments their ancestors had never intended them to endure without technological assistance. On the high-gravity world of Kratos, human survivors developed severe skeletal deformities within a few generations, as their genetic modifications degraded without the medical interventions that had maintained them. The warp itself had grown more turbulent during the cybernetic revolt, though humanity lacked the context to understand why. The Eldar Empire's descent into depravity had accelerated, feeding the gestation of Slaanesh with psychic energy that created storms and disturbances throughout the Immaterium. Human navigators reported increasingly difficult conditions during warp transit, with routes that had been reliable for millennia suddenly becoming dangerous or impassable. The combination of warp instability and the destruction of human infrastructure meant that many colonies found themselves isolated, cut off from contact with the rest of humanity, and forced to survive on their own resources. These isolated worlds would develop independently for thousands of years, their cultures and technologies diverging until they bore little resemblance to their common origins. The Eldar Empire's final centuries unfolded as a civilization consuming itself in pursuit of sensations that had long since crossed any boundary that might have once constrained them. The pleasure cults that had begun as fringe movements exploring extreme experiences had become the dominant force in Eldar society, their practices normalized to the point where abstaining from participation marked an individual as aberrant rather than the reverse. Entire worlds dedicated themselves to single aspects of excess, their populations pursuing specific forms of sensation with an intensity that would have horrified their ancestors. On the crone world of Lugganath, billions of Eldar devoted themselves to the perfection of murder as an art form, developing techniques to prolong death for days while the victim remained conscious, their psychic abilities used to amplify pain beyond anything physical nerves alone could transmit. The pleasure dens that dotted every major Eldar city had evolved into structures that existed partially in real space and partially in the warp, their architecture designed by psychically gifted architects who shaped Wraithbone into forms that responded to the emotions of those within them. Walking through these establishments meant experiencing environments that shifted and changed based on subconscious desires, walls that became transparent or opaque, depending on whether the observer wished to see what occurred beyond them, gravity that adjusted to facilitate movements that would be impossible under normal conditions. The Eldar who frequented these places sought experiences that transcended mere physical sensation, using their psychic abilities to link their consciousness with others in ways that created shared experiences of pleasure or pain that resonated through both the material world and the Immaterium. The psychic excess reached levels where individual Eldar could no longer distinguish between their own emotions and those bleeding through from the warp. An Eldar experiencing rage might find that emotion amplified by resonance from the Immaterium, feeding back into their psyche in a loop that intensified the feeling beyond any natural limit. The same applied to pleasure, fear, ambition, or any other emotion strong enough to create ripples in the warp. This feedback loop accelerated the Eldar's descent, as each extreme experience made the next one feel inadequate by comparison, driving them to pursue ever greater intensities to achieve the same psychological impact. The few Eldar who recognized this pattern and attempted to warn their fellows found themselves dismissed as unable to transcend their limitations, too bound by outdated moral frameworks to achieve true enlightenment. The Exodites had departed the core world's millennia before the final collapse, their leaders possessing enough foresight to recognize that Eldar civilization had embarked on a path that could only end in catastrophe. These conservative factions rejected the pleasure cults entirely, choosing instead to settle on maiden worlds scattered across the galaxy's periphery. The maiden worlds had been seeded with life by the Old Ones or by early Eldar colonization efforts, their ecosystems carefully designed to support Eldar habitation with minimal technological infrastructure. The Exodites deliberately regressed their technology, abandoning the sophisticated systems that defined mainstream Eldar culture in favor of simpler tools and methods. They bonded with great reptilian beasts that served as mounts and companions, creatures whose psychic presence was strong enough to be felt, but simple enough to avoid the corruption that plagued more complex minds. The craftworlds represented a different response to the same recognition of impending doom. These massive spacecraft, each the size of a small moon, had originally served as trading vessels and exploration platforms during the height of the Eldar Empire. Certain Eldar seers, their psychic abilities allowing them glimpses of possible futures, had foreseen the cataclysm approaching and convinced portions of the population to abandon the core worlds entirely. The craftworlds departed over the course of several millennia, each carrying millions of Eldar who chose exile over participation in their civilization's self-destruction. These refugees established self-contained societies aboard their vessels, attempting to preserve what they considered the best aspects of Eldar culture, while rejecting the excesses that had consumed the majority of their species. The Eldar who remained on the core worlds dismissed both the Exodites and the craftworld Eldar as cowards or fools, unable to embrace the transcendence that awaited those brave enough to pursue experience without limitation. They pointed to their own achievements, the heights of sensation and consciousness they had reached through their practices, as evidence that the warnings of conservative factions were baseless fear-mongering. Some pleasure cults actively mocked those who had fled, creating elaborate performances that depicted the Exodites as primitive degenerates who had abandoned civilization for dirt and beasts, or the craftworld Eldar as sterile obsessives who would wither away in their flying tombs while the true Eldar achieved apotheosis. The presence growing in the warp had achieved something approaching consciousness by the final millennium before its birth. Slaanesh, though it did not yet possess that name or full awareness of itself as a distinct entity, had accumulated enough psychic energy to begin actively influencing events in real space. Eldar psychers reported dreams and visions of a being of terrible beauty that promised pleasures beyond imagination to those who would serve it. These visions came with sensations of such intensity that some psychers died from the experience, their nervous systems unable to process the level of stimulation being transmitted through their psychic connection to the immaterium. Others became addicted to these visions, spending every moment in meditative trances attempting to recapture the feelings they had experienced, their physical bodies wasting away from neglect, while their consciousness remained fixated on the entity taking shape in the warp. The final descent accelerated beyond any possibility of reversal during the last century before Slaanesh's birth. Murder cults that had previously limited themselves to killing non-Eldar or volunteers from within their own ranks began targeting random Eldar citizens, the taboo against killing their own kind eroding as the pursuit of novel experiences overrode all other considerations. On the Crone world of Belial IV, a cult dedicated to the perfection of betrayal-engineered scenarios, where Eldar would be forced to choose between their own survival and that of their families, psychically recording the emotional anguish of those moments to experience later as a form of entertainment. The planetary authorities, themselves members of various pleasure cults, made no attempt to intervene, viewing these activities as legitimate artistic expression rather than crimes requiring punishment. The psychic pressure building in the warp had begun to manifest physical effects in real space. Reality itself grew thin in the regions surrounding the Eldar core worlds, the barrier between dimensions weakening as the gestating god drew more power from the Eldar's continued excesses. Psychers reported that using their abilities had become simultaneously easier and more dangerous, as the warp's energy flowed more readily into the material universe, but brought with it influences that corrupted any working that drew too deeply on immaterium power. Some Eldar found their psychic abilities manifesting spontaneously without conscious activation, their emotional states triggering effects in real space that reflected their inner turmoil. An Eldar experiencing rage might find objects around them spontaneously combusting, while one lost in grief could cause plants to wither and die simply by being near them. The other species inhabiting the galaxy remained largely unaware of what approached, though some experienced effects they could not explain. Human colonies in regions near the Eldar core worlds reported increased instances of psychic phenomena, with individuals who had never shown any psychic ability suddenly manifesting powers that they could not control. Orks in those same regions grew more frenzied than usual, their weird boys channeling energies that seemed to come from sources beyond the normal Gestalt field generated by Ork populations. The Necrons, those few tomb worlds that had awakened early from their great sleep due to malfunctioning stasis systems, detected massive disturbances in the warp through their ancient monitoring equipment, though they lacked context to understand what these readings signified. The birth of Slaanesh occurred in a single catastrophic moment that spanned both real space and the immaterium, though the exact timing remains subject to debate among Imperial scholars who would later study these events. The most commonly accepted date places it in the transition between the 29th and 30th millennia, though the warp's non-linear nature makes precise temporal measurement impossible. The psychic implosion began at the heart of the Eldar Empire, in the densely populated core worlds where billions of Eldar had concentrated their pursuit of excess. The entity that had been gestating for millions of years achieved full consciousness in an instant, and that moment of awakening created a psychic shockwave that propagated through the warp and into real space with devastating effect. The Eldar died in numbers that defied comprehension. Trillions of souls were torn from their bodies in the span of heartbeats, drawn into the warp by the newborn god's insatiable hunger. Slaanesh consumed these souls with the greed of a being that had waited millennia to truly exist, each Eldar consciousness absorbed adding to the god's power and awareness. The Eldar's psychic nature, which had made them the dominant species in the galaxy for millions of years, became the vector for their extermination. Their souls burned so brightly in the warp that Slaanesh could perceive and claim them across vast distances, drawing them in regardless of any protection or resistance they might attempt. An Eldar on a core world died no differently than one who had been traveling through the webway or living on a distant colony, their soul ripped from their body and consumed by she who thirsts. The Eye of Terror opened where the Eldar core worlds had existed, a massive wound in reality where the barrier between real space and the warp collapsed entirely. The region, which had contained hundreds of densely populated star systems, transformed into a zone where the laws of physics became suggestions rather than rules. Demons poured through into real space, no longer constrained by the need to possess hosts or force their way through weakened barriers. Time flowed inconsistently within the Eye, with some regions experiencing millennia, while others remained frozen in single moments. The planets that had hosted the Crone world's magnificent cities became demon worlds, their matter and energy reshaped by the warp's influence into landscapes that reflected the nightmares and obsessions of the entities that now claimed them. The psychic shockwave from Slaanesh's birth propagated outward from the Eye of Terror at speeds that exceeded light, its effects diminishing with distance, but remaining devastating across a substantial portion of the galaxy. Human colonies thousands of light years from the Eldar core worlds experienced the shockwave as a moment of overwhelming psychic pressure that drove untrained psychers insane or killed them outright. On Terra, the Emperor felt the birth of the new Chaos God as a fundamental shift in the warp's nature, recognizing immediately that the galaxy had changed in ways that would affect all his plans for humanity's future. The warp storms that had been growing more severe during the final years of the Eldar Empire intensified catastrophically, cutting off entire sectors of space from any possibility of warp travel. The craftworld Eldar survived because their vessels existed outside the immediate region of Slaanesh's birth, and because their seers had prepared protective measures. The infinity circuits built into each craftworld's psychic matrices designed to capture Eldar souls at death and preserve them within the vessel's structure, shielded their populations from the worst of the psychic implosion. The craftworld's distance from the core worlds meant the shockwave had weakened somewhat by the time it reached them, though many Eldar still died as Slaanesh's hunger drew their souls toward the newborn god. The survivors found themselves transformed from refugees preserving their culture into the last remnants of a species that had been reduced from trillions to a tiny fraction of their former numbers in a single apocalyptic moment. The Exodites on their maiden worlds fared somewhat better due to their distance from the core worlds and their rejection of the psychic excesses that had characterized mainstream Eldar culture. Their simpler lifestyles and deliberate limitation of their psychic abilities made them less visible to Slaanesh's hunger, though many still died as the shockwave passed through their worlds. The great reptilian beasts they had bonded with helped anchor their souls to real space through psychic connections that were strong but uncomplicated, providing a degree of protection that more sophisticated psychic techniques could not match. The exodite populations survived in larger percentages than those on the craft worlds, though they remained isolated on scattered worlds with no means of coordinating with other survivors or understanding the full scope of the catastrophe that had befallen their species. The Drukhari, those Eldar who would become the Dark Eldar, survived through a combination of location and practice. They had established themselves in Camorra, a vast city built within the webway itself, its location deep within the network of tunnels placing it outside normal space and providing some insulation from the psychic shockwave. The Drukhari had already begun practicing the arts that would define their future culture, sustaining themselves by inflicting suffering on others and feeding on the psychic energy released by pain and terror. This practice, horrific as it was, meant they had developed techniques for manipulating souls and psychic energy that gave them tools to resist Slaanesh's pull. They sealed Camorra away from the sections of the webway that had been compromised by the birth of the Chaos God, isolating themselves in the depths of the ancient network, where they could continue their existence hidden from she who thirsts direct attention. The birth of Slaanesh fundamentally altered the nature of the warp in ways that affected every psychically active species in the galaxy. The Immaterium, which had been growing more turbulent throughout the Eldar Empire's decline, now contained 4 major chaos gods rather than 3. Khorne, Nurgle, and Tzeentch, the entities that had coalesced from the psychic echoes of earlier conflicts and civilizations, gained a sibling in Slaanesh, the Dark Prince whose domain encompassed pleasure, pain, excess, and the pursuit of perfection. The balance of power within the warp shifted as the Chaos Gods competed for influence and followers, their conflicts creating storms and disturbances that made warp travel exponentially more dangerous than it had been during the Dark Age of technology. Human civilization, already fragmented by the cybernetic revolt and the regression that followed, found itself further isolated as the warp storm spawned by Slaanesh's birth cut off communication and travel between vast regions of space. Colonies that had maintained sporadic contact with neighboring systems suddenly found themselves completely alone, their attempts to send ships through the warp resulting in vessels that never arrived at their destinations, or that emerged in real space thousands of light years from their intended courses. The Age of Strife, which had begun with humanity's war against the Men of Iron, entered its most catastrophic phase as the species that had once spread across the galaxy found itself reduced to isolated pockets, struggling to survive without support or coordination. The Eldar survivors, whether on craft worlds, exodite worlds, or hidden in Camorra, faced a future defined by the knowledge that their species had created the very god that now hunted them. Every Eldar soul that died without the protection of a spirit stone or similar safeguard would be claimed by Slaanesh, consumed by she who thirsts to feed the insatiable appetite of a god born from their ancestors' excesses. The magnificent empire that had dominated the galaxy for millions of years had been reduced to scattered remnants in a single moment, and the Eldar who remained alive knew that they could never reclaim what had been lost, that their species would exist forever in the shadow of their greatest failure. The warp storms that erupted across the galaxy in the wake of Slaanesh's birth transformed interstellar travel from a calculated risk into an act of near-certain suicide. Human navigators who had guided ships through the Immaterium for thousands of years found their abilities suddenly inadequate against currents that shifted without pattern or warning. The carefully charted routes that had connected human civilization dissolved as the warp convulsed with energies released by the newborn Chaos God. Ships that entered the Immaterium during this period faced fates that varied from the merely catastrophic to the incomprehensibly horrific. Some vessels emerged in real space thousands of light years from their intended destinations, their crews aged to dust or transformed into things that retained human shape but had lost any recognizable humanity. Others never emerged at all, lost in the warp's depths or translated into demon-infested hulks that would later plague shipping lanes when the storms finally calmed. The isolation came swiftly and absolutely. Human worlds that had maintained regular contact with neighboring systems through trade convoys and communication relays found themselves cut off within months of Slaanesh's birth. The astropathic networks that allowed psychic communication across interstellar distances collapsed as the telepaths maintaining them went insane or died from the psychic pressure emanating from the roiling warp. An astropath attempting to send a message during the early years of the Age of Strife would feel their consciousness torn apart by entities that now prowled the immaterium with unprecedented freedom, demons that had been empowered by the fourth Chaos God's emergence and the weakening of reality's barriers. The few messages that did get through arrived garbled beyond recognition or carried corruption that infected the receiving astropaths with madness that spread to anyone they contacted. Human civilization fragmented into thousands of isolated pockets, each world or small cluster of systems forced to survive on whatever resources they possessed when the warp storms cut them off from the rest of humanity. The colonies that had maintained diverse economies and robust manufacturing capabilities fared better initially, their populations able to continue producing food, medicine, and basic equipment without external support. Worlds that had specialized in specific industries as part of the larger interstellar economy faced immediate crises as they lost access to the goods they had previously imported. A mining world that had exported raw materials in exchange for food found its population starving within years as hydroponic facilities failed and no relief shipments arrived. Manufacturing centers that had relied on imported raw materials watched their factories fall silent as stockpiles depleted and no new resources came through the warp routes. The technological regression that had begun during the cybernetic revolt accelerated catastrophically during the Age of Strife. The SDC databases that had preserved human knowledge for millennia continued to degrade, their data corrupted by age, poor maintenance, or deliberate sabotage during the conflicts that erupted on isolated worlds. Engineers attempting to manufacture complex equipment found that the templates they consulted contained errors or gaps, producing devices that failed in unpredictable ways or simply did not function at all. Each generation lost more knowledge than the previous one, as the infrastructure required to train new technicians and scientists crumbled. A world might retain the ability to produce fusion reactors for several centuries after isolation, then lose that capability when the last engineer who understood the manufacturing process died without successfully training a replacement. The emergence of psychers among humanity's population increased dramatically during the Age of Strife, the species' latent psychic potential manifesting in growing numbers as humanity's evolution continued along the path the Emperor had foreseen millennia earlier. Before the Age of Strife, a human world might host a handful of individuals with active psychic abilities across its entire population. During the isolation, that number increased exponentially with each generation. Children began displaying powers that their parents could neither understand nor control, abilities that manifested without warning and often with lethal consequences. A young psyker experiencing their first emotional crisis might accidentally immolate everyone within 100 meters, their uncontrolled pyrokinesis triggered by fear or anger. Another might tear a hole in reality through which demons could pour, their nascent connection to the warp exploited by entities that had been waiting for precisely such an opportunity. The demon incursions that followed psychic manifestations created catastrophes that dwarfed the immediate damage caused by the psychers themselves. A single possessed individual could serve as an anchor point for dozens of warp entities, each demon using the psycher's body as a gateway into real space. These possessed psychers retained enough of their original form to move among human populations, spreading corruption and opening additional breaches in reality's fabric. On the hive world of Monarchia, a psycher's possession triggered a cascade that saw half the planetary population transformed into demon hosts within a month, the survivors forced to flee into the Underhive, where they waged a desperate guerrilla war against entities that had once been their neighbors and families. The planet's authorities, lacking any understanding of how to combat demonic incursion, resorted to increasingly desperate measures that killed as many uninfected citizens as possessed ones. Human societies responded to the psyker threat with violence born from terror and ignorance. Witch hunts became commonplace across thousands of isolated worlds, their populations attempting to purge anyone who displayed even minor psychic abilities before they could trigger a demonic manifestation. The methods used to identify psykers varied from crude superstition to slightly more sophisticated testing, but all shared a fundamental lack of understanding about the nature of psychic power. Communities might execute anyone who displayed unusual intelligence or intuition, operating under the assumption that any deviation from normal human capabilities indicated psychic contamination. These purges killed countless innocent people alongside actual psykers, creating climates of paranoia where neighbors informed on each other and families turned against their own members to avoid being associated with suspected witches. The irony of these witch hunts lay in their counterproductive nature. Executing psykers without proper precautions often triggered the very demonic manifestations the purges aimed to prevent, as dying psykers lost control of their abilities in their final moments. A psyker burned at the stake might tear open a warp rift with their death scream, releasing horrors that consumed the crowd that had gathered to witness the execution. Communities that conducted mass purges sometimes found themselves facing demon incursions on scales that exceeded anything a single living psyker might have caused, the accumulated psychic death energy creating beacons that drew warp entities from across the immaterium. The survivors of these incidents rarely recognized the connection between their actions and the catastrophes that followed, instead interpreting the demon attacks as evidence that they had not been thorough enough in identifying and eliminating witches. The fates of human worlds during the Age of Strife varied so dramatically that generalizations became nearly meaningless. Some colonies maintained relatively advanced technological bases and stable governments throughout the 5,000 years of isolation. These fortunate worlds possessed complete or near-complete SDC databases, populations large enough to maintain specialized knowledge across multiple fields, and leadership capable of organizing effective responses to the crises that arose. They established protocols for identifying and containing psykers before their abilities could manifest catastrophically, developing training programs that taught nascent psykers basic control techniques, even if the underlying theory remained poorly understood. These worlds emerged from the Age of Strife diminished but intact, their populations remembering that they had once been part of a greater human civilization and maintaining hope that contact might someday be reestablished. Other worlds descended into feudalism as their technological infrastructure collapsed and knowledge of advanced manufacturing techniques disappeared. These planets regressed to pre-industrial conditions within a few generations, their populations fragmenting into kingdoms or city-states ruled by warlords who controlled access to whatever functioning technology remained. A noble house might base its power on possession of a single still functional laser weapon, the device maintained through ritual and superstition rather than genuine understanding of its mechanisms. These feudal worlds developed elaborate myths about the time before the isolation, transforming the dark age of technology into legends of a golden age when humans had possessed godlike powers and traveled between the stars on ships of light. The specifics of these myths varied wildly, with some worlds remembering space travel as literal journeys to heaven, while others reinterpreted it as purely metaphorical ascension to enlightenment. The worst affected worlds fell to complete barbarism, their populations reduced to tribal societies that retained no memory of their spacefaring origins. These planets had suffered particularly severe catastrophes during the early years of isolation, whether from demon incursions, environmental collapse, or civil wars that destroyed what remained of their infrastructure. The survivors reverted to hunter-gatherer existences or primitive agriculture, their technology limited to stone tools, and whatever metal implements they could scavenge from ruins they no longer understood. Some of these worlds developed cargo cults around ancient artifacts, worshipping non-functional machinery as religious relics and conducting elaborate rituals in the hope of awakening the device's power. A tribe might base its entire spiritual practice around a broken data terminal, their shamans conducting ceremonies before the dark screen, while reciting corrupted fragments of technical manuals transformed into holy scripture. Alien invasions during the Age of Strife claimed worlds that might otherwise have survived the isolation intact. The Orks, ever present and opportunistic, descended on human colonies that could no longer call for help or receive reinforcements. Human defenders found themselves fighting greenskin hordes with dwindling ammunition stocks and failing equipment, each battle consuming resources that could not be replaced. Some worlds held out for centuries through desperate ingenuity and sacrifice, their populations becoming warrior societies where every citizen trained for combat from childhood. Others fell within years, their populations enslaved or exterminated by orc warbands that then moved on to seek new fights elsewhere. The Orks cared nothing for administration or governance, leaving conquered human worlds as burned-out husks or allowing surviving humans to persist as prey for ongoing raids. The Aeldari, both the Craftworld survivors and the Drukhari raiders emerging from Camorra, preyed on isolated human worlds with impunity during this period. Craftworld Aeldari conducted raids to capture humans for use in their war against chaos, their need for warriors and workers overriding any moral considerations about kidnapping members of a younger species. The Drukhari pursued more sinister objectives, raiding human settlements to capture slaves for the arenas of Camorra or to harvest the psychic energy released by torture and suffering. Human defenders had no effective response to Aeldari raiders who could appear without warning through webway portals, strike with weapons that seemed like sorcery to populations that had lost understanding of advanced technology, and disappear before any organized resistance could form. The raids left traumatized populations that developed elaborate defenses against enemies they could neither predict nor effectively fight. Other xenospecies took advantage of humanity's weakness to expand into territories that had previously been contested or under human control. The exact identities of many of these species have been lost to history, as the Imperium's later campaigns of xenocide eliminated them so thoroughly that only fragmentary records survive. Some were relatively benign, establishing peaceful coexistence with human populations and even providing assistance during crises. Others proved as predatory as the Orks or Drukhari, viewing isolated human worlds as resources to be exploited or threats to be eliminated. Human colonies that accepted Xeno's protection or integration often survived the Age of Strife more successfully than those that attempted to maintain independence, though these worlds would later face severe consequences when the Great Crusade reached them and Imperial forces discovered humans living under alien rule or alongside Xeno's populations. Chaos corruption spread across human space during the Age of Strife, with a virulence that the species had never previously encountered. The warp's increased turbulence meant that demons could manifest in real space more easily than at any time since the Enslaver Plague, and they found human populations completely unprepared to resist their influence. Chaos cults formed on thousands of worlds, their members worshipping the dark gods in exchange for power, or simply for survival in environments where traditional authority structures had collapsed. A starving population might turn to Nurgle, accepting disease and mutation in exchange for the ability to survive on food that would kill uninfected humans. Warriors facing impossible odds might dedicate themselves to Khorne, trading their souls for the strength to defeat their enemies. Scholars seeking knowledge lost in the regression might bargain with Tzeentch, receiving insights that came with madness and corruption. The worlds that fell completely to chaos became nightmare realms where reality itself bent to accommodate demonic presence. These planets saw their populations transformed into cultists or mutants, their cities rebuilt according to geometries that hurt to observe, their very atmospheres tainted with warp energy that corrupted anyone who breathed it. Some of these corrupted worlds maintained functional societies of a sort, their populations organizing around the worship of specific chaos gods and conducting raids against neighboring systems to gather slaves and resources. Others descended into pure anarchy, their surfaces becoming battlegrounds where different chaos factions fought each other with the same enthusiasm they directed against uninfected humans. The Imperium would later designate many of these worlds as perdita, beyond any hope of reclamation, and suitable only for orbital bombardment or virus bombing. The variations in how human populations adapted to isolation created a diversity that would later complicate the Imperium's efforts to reunify humanity. Worlds that had maintained advanced technology developed cultures centered around the techno-aristocracies that controlled access to functioning equipment. Feudal worlds created elaborate social hierarchies based on bloodlines that supposedly traced back to the original colonists or to heroes who had defended the planet during the early years of isolation. Feral worlds developed tribal structures where strength and survival skills determined status, their populations viewing the ruins of ancient cities as haunted places to be avoided rather than resources to be salvaged. Each isolated human society evolved its own customs, languages, and belief systems, the common heritage of humanity fragmenting into thousands of distinct cultures that shared only the most basic biological similarities. Religious movements proliferated during the Age of Strife as human populations sought explanations for the catastrophes that had befallen them and hope for eventual salvation. Some worlds developed elaborate theologies around the Emperor, though they possessed no knowledge of his actual existence or nature. These proto-imperial cults worshipped a divine father figure who would someday return to reunite humanity and restore the lost Golden Age, their beliefs based on garbled legends and psychic intuitions rather than any direct revelation. Other worlds created pantheons of gods based on corrupted memories of historical figures or personifications of natural forces. A few maintained secular philosophies that rejected supernatural explanations in favor of materialist interpretations of their circumstances, though these rationalist societies often struggled to explain the demon incursions and psychic phenomena that contradicted their worldviews. The 5,000 years of the Age of Strife saw human population numbers fluctuate wildly across the species' former territory. Worlds that had supported billions saw their populations crash to millions or even thousands as infrastructure failed and resources depleted. Other planets experienced population explosions as the loss of advanced medicine and contraception combined with social pressures to produce as many children as possible to replace losses from warfare and disaster. The total human population across the galaxy almost certainly declined from the heights reached during the Dark Age of technology, though exact figures remain impossible to calculate given the lack of communication between isolated worlds and the complete loss of records from colonies that disappeared entirely. The Emperor observed humanity's suffering during the Age of Strife from Terra, his plans for the species' unification frustrated by the warp storms that made interstellar travel impossible even for a being of his power. He worked throughout this period to prepare for the eventual reunification, conducting genetic experiments that would culminate in the creation of the Primarchs and the Space Marine Legions. He also labored to unify Terra itself, a process that would take centuries of warfare as he conquered the techno-barbarian warlords who had claimed different regions of humanity's birth world. The Emperor understood that when the warp storms finally calmed enough to permit renewed space travel, humanity would need to reunify quickly and completely, that the species could not afford another period of isolation and fragmentation. Human worlds that maintained some level of technology attempted to preserve knowledge for future generations through various means. Some established orders of tech priests who memorized maintenance procedures and manufacturing techniques, passing them down through apprenticeship systems that emphasized rote learning over genuine understanding. Others encoded knowledge in religious texts, transforming technical manuals into sacred scriptures whose ritual recitation supposedly pleased the machine spirits inhabiting equipment. A few worlds developed their own scientific traditions independent of STC databases, their scholars rediscovering principles through experimentation and observation, though their progress remained limited by the resources available on isolated planets. These various preservation efforts ensured that human technological knowledge survived the Age of Strife in fragmentary and often corrupted forms, providing foundations that the Imperium would later build upon during the Great Crusade. The Age of Strife fundamentally transformed humanity from a unified spacefaring civilization into a fragmented species scattered across thousands of isolated worlds, each developing independently and facing unique challenges. The diversity this created would become both a strength and a weakness for the Imperium that would eventually emerge from Terra. Human adaptability had allowed the species to survive in environments ranging from paradises to hellscapes, but the cultural and technological divisions between different human populations would require centuries of warfare and diplomacy to overcome. The Emperor's vision of a unified human empire spanning the galaxy had been delayed but not destroyed by the Age of Strife, and when the warp storms finally began to calm in the 30th millennium, humanity would be ready to reclaim its place among the stars. The Emperor had walked among humanity for millennia as advisor, warrior, and scholar, always maintaining the careful distance necessary to prevent his presence from becoming the focus of worship or dependency. The Age of Strife forced him to abandon this approach. Terra itself had descended into a nightmare of warring factions, its surface scarred by atomic warfare, and its populations ruled by techno-barbarian warlords who commanded armies equipped with fragments of Dark Age technology they barely understood. The warp storms that isolated human worlds across the galaxy had not spared humanity's birth world, and the Emperor recognized that if Terra could not be unified and strengthened, his plans for humanity's future would die before they could begin. The decision to reveal himself came not from pride or impatience, but from calculated necessity. The psychic awakening accelerating across humanity meant that more psykers manifested with each generation, and Terra's population suffered from demon incursions that grew more frequent and devastating. The techno-barbarian warlords lacked any understanding of how to combat these threats, responding to psychic manifestations with superstitious violence that often made situations worse. The Emperor possessed the knowledge and power to establish protocols for identifying and training psykers, to create defenses against demonic incursion, and to preserve the technological knowledge that Terra's warring factions were destroying in their endless conflicts. These capabilities required him to operate openly rather than from the shadows. The Emperor emerged in the late 29th millennium, appearing first to the warlords who controlled the regions surrounding the Himalaysian mountains. He did not announce himself as a god or demand worship, but rather presented himself as humanity's rightful ruler based on demonstrable superiority. His psychic abilities allowed him to prove his claims in ways that left no room for doubt. A warlord who challenged him would find his weapons refusing to fire, his warriors frozen in place by psychic compulsion, or his fortress's defenses turning against him at the Emperor's command. These demonstrations combined overwhelming force with precision that minimized casualties among the common soldiers, the Emperor understanding that he would need these warriors once their leaders submitted or were eliminated. The creation of the Thunder Warriors represented the Emperor's first major project in gene-enhanced super soldiers, though they bore only superficial resemblance to the Space Marines who would later replace them. The Emperor had spent millennia studying human genetics and the techniques the Old Ones had used to create their warrior races during the War in Heaven. He combined this theoretical knowledge with practical experimentation conducted in laboratories hidden beneath the Himalaysian mountains, facilities that had survived the Age of Strife intact due to their remote location and sophisticated defenses. The Thunder Warriors emerged from these laboratories as men transformed into living weapons, their bodies enhanced far beyond normal human capabilities through a combination of genetic manipulation, organ implantation, and psycho-conditioning. A Thunder Warrior stood head and shoulders above a normal human, his enhanced musculature visible even through the armor he wore. The augmentation process that created them involved extensive surgery to implant additional organs that boosted strength, reflexes, and resilience to levels that made them capable of fighting multiple unenhanced humans simultaneously. Their bones had been reinforced with ceramic compounds that made them nearly unbreakable, while their cardiovascular systems had been enhanced to pump blood with such efficiency that they could fight for hours without tiring. The psycho-conditioning imprinted absolute loyalty to the emperor and removed most emotional responses that might interfere with combat effectiveness, creating warriors who felt neither fear nor hesitation when ordered into battle. The Thunder Warriors' equipment reflected the emperor's access to Dark Age technology and his understanding of what would be needed to conquer Terra's warlords. Their power armor, while crude compared to the suits that would later be manufactured for Space Marines, provided protection against most weapons the techno-barbarians could deploy. The armor's servomotors amplified the already considerable strength of the warriors wearing it, allowing them to wield weapons that would require crew-served mounts for normal soldiers. Thunder Warriors typically carried bolters, mass reactive weapons that fired explosive-tipped rounds capable of penetrating armor and detonating inside targets. The combination of superhuman warriors and superior equipment gave the Emperor's forces overwhelming advantages in the battles that followed. The Unification Wars began in earnest as the Emperor led his Thunder Warriors against the techno-barbarian kingdoms that controlled Terra's various regions. The conflicts followed patterns that would be repeated thousands of times during the later Great Crusade, with the Emperor offering terms of surrender before each engagement and resorting to force only when his offers were rejected. The warlords who accepted the Emperor's terms found themselves integrated into his growing administration, their technical expertise and knowledge of local conditions making them valuable assets despite their previous opposition. Those who refused faced Thunder Warrior assaults that demonstrated the futility of resistance against the Emperor's forces. The Pan-Pacific Empire controlled vast territories across what had once been Asia and the Pacific regions, its rulers commanding armies equipped with functional Dark Age weapon systems, including plasma cannons and gravitational manipulation devices. The Empire's forces had conquered numerous smaller kingdoms during the Age of Strife, establishing a hierarchical society where technical knowledge determined social status. The ruling class maintained their power through control of STC fragments and the manufacturing facilities needed to produce advanced weapons, while the lower classes served as soldiers and laborers with no access to the knowledge that might allow them to challenge their superiors. The Emperor's initial diplomatic overtures to the Pan-Pacific Empire met with contempt, its rulers viewing him as simply another warlord whose claims of superiority would be disproven on the battlefield. The war against the Pan-Pacific Empire lasted for decades, its campaigns involving battles across territories that stretched from the Himalayan mountains to the islands of the Pacific. Thunder Warriors assaulted fortified positions that had stood for centuries, their enhanced abilities allowing them to breach defenses that would have stopped conventional armies. The Empire's plasma weapons could kill Thunder Warriors, their superheated bolts burning through even reinforced armor and flash cooking the enhanced flesh beneath. But the Thunder Warriors' superior tactics and the Emperor's strategic direction ensured that casualties remained acceptable. The Emperor personally led critical assaults, his presence on battlefields turning potential defeats into victories through psychic powers that could deflect incoming fire or collapse fortifications with focused telekinetic force. The ethnarchies of the Frank and Europa regions presented different challenges than the Pan-Pacific Empire. These territories had fragmented into dozens of small kingdoms, each ruled by noble houses that claimed descent from the original colonists or from heroes of the Age of Strife. The ethnarchies possessed less advanced technology than the Pan-Pacific Empire, but compensated through numerical superiority and defensive positions built into the ruins of ancient cities. Their armies fought with a combination of improvised weapons and carefully maintained relics from before the Age of Strife, their tactics emphasizing defensive warfare designed to make conquest prohibitively expensive for attackers. The Emperor's approach to the ethnarchies involved isolating individual kingdoms and offering generous terms to those who surrendered, gradually building a coalition of former enemies who joined his forces in conquering their neighbors. The conquest of the Indonesian bloc demonstrated the Emperor's willingness to employ extreme measures when necessary. The bloc's rulers had embraced chaos worship during the Age of Strife, their populations corrupted by demonic influence to the point where conventional conquest and integration became impossible. Thunder warriors assaulted blocked territories with orders to show no mercy, their campaigns resembling extermination operations more than traditional warfare. The Emperor himself participated in the final assault on the block's capital, his psychic abilities essential for banishing the demons that manifested to defend their worshippers. The complete destruction of the Indonesic bloc sent a message to other Terran factions about the fate awaiting those who trafficked with the warp's entities. The alliance with Mars represented the Emperor's greatest diplomatic achievement during the Unification Wars. The Red Planet had maintained a degree of technological sophistication throughout the Age of Strife that exceeded anything remaining on Terra, its mechanicum preserving knowledge through religious devotion to the machine god. The tech priests of Mars had developed elaborate rituals around the maintenance and operation of machinery, transforming technical procedures into sacred rites that ensured knowledge transmission even when genuine understanding had been lost. The mechanicum controlled manufacturing capabilities that the Emperor needed for his plans, particularly the ability to produce power armor, weapons, and spacecraft in quantities that Terran facilities could not match. The Emperor's negotiations with Mars involved careful theological maneuvering. The mechanicum worshipped the machine god as the supreme deity governing all technology and mechanical systems. The Emperor presented himself not as a rival to this god, but as the Omnissiah, the machine god's prophet and representative in the material universe. This claim required demonstrating knowledge of technology that exceeded even what the mechanicum's most learned tech priests possessed. The Emperor shared secrets of Dark Age manufacturing techniques and revealed understanding of machine spirits that convinced the mechanicum's leadership of his divine mandate. The Treaty of Mars formalized an alliance that granted the mechanicum significant autonomy in exchange for their manufacturing support and technical expertise. The Emperor's secret projects proceeded in parallel with the Unification Wars, conducted in laboratories that only his most trusted servants could access. The Primarch project represented his most ambitious genetic engineering effort, an attempt to create 20 beings who would combine the best aspects of humanity with capabilities that approached his own. The Emperor worked with genetic material that he had been collecting and refining for millennia, incorporating elements derived from his own enhanced biology, along with carefully selected traits from human populations across Terra. Each Primarch was designed to excel in specific areas, their genetic templates optimized for different aspects of leadership and warfare that would be needed during the coming Great Crusade. The Primarch's creation involved techniques that went beyond conventional genetic engineering into areas that touched on the warp itself. The Emperor understood that purely material enhancements would be insufficient for beings intended to lead humanity's conquest of the galaxy. Each Primarch possessed a connection to the Immaterium that enhanced their already considerable abilities, though this connection remained carefully controlled and channeled to prevent the corruption that plagued unprotected psychers. The gestation chambers where the Primarchs developed incorporated technologies that the Emperor had recovered from dozens of different sources, combining human innovation with principles derived from studying Old One's artifacts and Necron biotransference systems. The Astronomican's development required solving problems that had frustrated human scientists throughout the Age of Strife. The device needed to project a psychic beacon powerful enough to be perceived across the entire galaxy, providing a reference point that navigators could use to plot courses through the warp even during periods of turbulence. The Emperor's own psychic power would serve as the Astronomican's core, but sustaining such a beacon continuously would require additional psychic energy beyond what even he could provide indefinitely. The solution involved creating a choir of psychers whose combined consciousness could channel and amplify the Emperor's psychic output, though the implementation of this system would wait until after the Unification Wars concluded and stable recruitment of psychers became possible. The Emperor's preparations extended to the creation of infrastructure that would support the Imperium he intended to build. The Imperial Palace began construction in the Himalayan mountains, its foundations laid in bedrock that had remained stable throughout Terra's tumultuous history. The palace would serve not merely as the emperor's residence, but as the administrative center for an empire spanning millions of worlds, its facilities designed to house the bureaucracies needed to coordinate such a vast territory. The construction employed both thunder warriors as laborers and skilled craftsmen recruited from conquered territories, their combined efforts creating structures that blended functionality with grandeur on scales that dwarfed anything built during the Age of Strife. The gene seed that would later be used to create space marines began development during this period, though the Emperor recognized that the Thunder Warriors' augmentation process was too crude and unstable for long-term use. The Thunder Warriors suffered from genetic degradation that would eventually kill them, their enhanced bodies breaking down after years of service, as the modifications that gave them superhuman abilities also accelerated cellular aging and caused organ failures. The Emperor designed the gene seed to avoid these problems through a more sophisticated approach that would integrate enhancements at a deeper level, creating warriors who could serve for centuries rather than decades. The development process required extensive testing and refinement that would continue even after the Unification Wars ended. The consolidation of Terra proceeded steadily as the Emperor's forces conquered or absorbed the remaining independent factions. The Thunder Warriors' reputation preceded them, their victories against the Pan-Pacific Empire and the ethnarchies convincing many warlords that resistance would prove futile. Some regions surrendered without fighting, their leaders calculating that service to the Emperor offered better prospects than defeat in battles they could not win. Others fought desperate defensive campaigns that ended in their annihilation when they refused terms that would have preserved their populations, if not their power. The Emperor demonstrated consistent patterns in these conquests, offering mercy to those who submitted, but showing no hesitation in destroying factions that threatened his plans through their continued resistance or their corruption by chaos. The final battles of the Unification Wars took place in the Rad Wastes and ruined hive cities that covered much of Terra's surface. These regions hosted populations that had regressed to barbarism during the Age of Strife, their inhabitants mutated by radiation exposure and chemical contamination into forms that barely qualified as human. The Emperor's forces conducted campaigns in these territories that combined military operations with humanitarian relief, the Thunder Warriors protecting work crews who established purification systems and medical facilities. The populations of these regions, once stabilized and provided with clean water and food, became sources of recruits for the armies that would be needed for the Great Crusade. Terra's unification under the Emperor's rule created the foundation necessary for humanity's expansion back into the galaxy, but the Emperor understood that unifying one world represented only the beginning of his plans. The warp storms that had isolated human civilization for 5,000 years were beginning to calm, their intensity decreasing to levels that would soon permit reliable interstellar travel. The Emperor's preparations during the Unification Wars had created the tools and infrastructure needed to launch the Great Crusade, but success would require more than superior weapons and enhanced warriors. It would demand a vision of humanity's future, compelling enough to unite worlds that had developed independently for millennia, and the strength to impose that vision on those who refused to accept it peacefully. The Emperor's laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains represented the culmination of knowledge accumulated across 38,000 years of observation, study, and experimentation. The facilities extended deep into Terra's crust, their lowest levels reaching depths where the bedrock itself had remained undisturbed since the planet's formation. The chambers where the Primarchs gestated incorporated technologies that blended human innovation with principles the Emperor had derived from studying artifacts left by civilizations that had preceded humanity by millions of years. Gestation pods constructed from materials that existed partially in real space and partially in the warp-lined walls inscribed with genetic formulae so complex that comprehending even fragments would take normal human scientists lifetimes of study. Each Primarch's genetic template had been designed with specific purposes in mind, their traits optimized for the different challenges the Emperor anticipated facing during humanity's reconquest of the galaxy. The first Primarch possessed genetics calibrated for strategic brilliance and the ability to inspire absolute loyalty in those who served under him. The second combined diplomatic sophistication with martial prowess, designed to win worlds through negotiation where possible and conquest were necessary. The Emperor had crafted each template to complement the others, intending that the 20 Primarchs would function as a coordinated leadership cadre capable of managing an empire spanning millions of worlds, while prosecuting military campaigns across thousands of light years simultaneously. The creation process involved manipulating genetic material at levels far beyond conventional engineering. The Emperor worked with the fundamental building blocks of life itself, adjusting individual base pairs in DNA sequences, while simultaneously shaping how those sequences would interact with the warp. Each Primarch possessed a soul that burned far brighter than normal humans, their psychic presence in the immaterium deliberately enhanced to provide capabilities that purely physical augmentation could never achieve. This connection to the warp remained carefully controlled through mechanisms the Emperor had built into their genetic structure, safeguards intended to prevent the corruption that plagued unprotected psychers, while allowing the Primarchs to draw on psychic power when needed. The gestation chambers maintained environments precisely calibrated to support the Primarchs' development as they grew from embryos into fully formed beings. Nutrient solutions flowed through systems that monitored and adjusted their composition thousands of times per second, ensuring that each developing Primarch received exactly what his unique physiology required. Psychic resonators embedded in the chamber walls projected patterns designed to shape the Primarch's consciousness as it formed, imprinting knowledge and capabilities that would allow them to function immediately upon reaching maturity, rather than requiring years of education and training. The Emperor visited the chambers regularly, his own psychic presence serving as a template that the developing Primarch's minds would unconsciously model themselves after. The Chaos Gods had observed the Emperor's work with growing concern. The entities that ruled the warp understood that the beings taking shape in those gestation chambers represented a threat to their influence over the galaxy. 20 demigods loyal to the Emperor and immune to demonic corruption through the safeguards built into their genetics would serve as the core of an empire that could unite humanity under a single banner. A unified human species guided by the Emperor's vision would be far more difficult to corrupt than the scattered, ignorant populations that currently struggled through the final years of the Age of Strife. The Chaos Gods recognized that they needed to act before the Primarchs reached maturity, and the Emperor could begin implementing his plans for the Great Crusade. The exact nature of how the Chaos Gods breached the Emperor's laboratories remains unclear in the fragmentary records that survived this event. The facilities possessed defenses that should have been impregnable, their psychic wards capable of repelling any demonic incursion, and their physical barriers proof against any conventional assault. Some accounts suggest that the Chaos Gods exploited a moment of vulnerability when the Emperor's attention was divided between multiple projects, creating an opening that would not normally exist. Others hint at betrayal from within, though the identity of any potential traitor has never been confirmed. The most disturbing theories propose that the Chaos Gods manipulated causality itself through their influence over the warp, creating circumstances where the breach became inevitable regardless of the Emperor's precautions. The warp portals that tore open within the gestation chambers manifested with violence that shattered containment systems and disrupted the carefully maintained environments. Alarms screamed warnings that came too late as energies from the immaterium flooded into spaces designed to exist in purely material reality. The Primarchs, still developing within their pods, were torn from their chambers by currents of warp energy that dragged them into the immaterium before any intervention could prevent it. The Emperor arrived within moments of the breach, his psychic abilities allowing him to perceive the disturbance instantly, but even his power proved insufficient to prevent the Chaos Gods from accomplishing their goal. The portals collapsed as quickly as they had appeared, sealing themselves before the Emperor could pursue the stolen Primarchs into the warp. The scattering dispersed the 20 Primarchs across the galaxy, each infant demigod ejected from the warp onto worlds, separated by thousands of light years. The Chaos Gods had not simply stolen the Primarchs, but had deliberately placed them in environments calculated to shape their development in ways that might make them susceptible to corruption or turn them against the Emperor's plans. Some Primarchs found themselves on death worlds, where survival required becoming killers before they could walk. Others landed on planets ruled by tyrants or corrupted by chaos, their formative years spent in circumstances designed to traumatize or corrupt them. A few arrived on relatively benign worlds where they would be raised with love and care, though even these placements served the Chaos Gods' purposes by ensuring that the Primarchs would develop loyalties to their adoptive cultures that might conflict with the Emperor's vision. The Emperor's response to the scattering demonstrated both his strategic flexibility and his absolute determination to see his plans through despite this catastrophic setback. The Primarchs had been intended as the commanders of the Space Marine legions, their genetic material serving as the templates from which the gene seed would be derived. The Emperor still possessed samples of each Primarch's genetic code, carefully preserved specimens that had been stored separately from the gestation chambers as a precaution against exactly this sort of disaster. These samples would allow him to proceed with creating the Space Marine legions, even without the Primarchs themselves present to lead them, though the legions would lack the guidance their gene fathers had been designed to provide. The gene seed development accelerated as the Emperor redirected resources toward creating the Space Marines, who would serve as the Great Crusade's primary military force. Each legion's gene seed derived from one of the 20 Primarchs' genetic templates, incorporating the specific traits and capabilities that had been engineered into their gene father. The First Legion's gene seed produced warriors with enhanced strategic thinking and leadership abilities, reflecting their Primarch's design strengths. The Second Legion's gene seed created Space Marines, who excelled at both diplomacy and combat, their genetics expressing the dual nature their Primarch had been intended to embody. The Emperor established production facilities on Terra and Mars, where gene seed could be implanted into carefully selected recruits, beginning the process of building the armies that would reconquer the galaxy. The Space Marine creation process involved extensive surgical modification of baseline humans, transforming them into transhuman warriors through the implantation of 19 additional organs derived from the gene seed. The procedure began with adolescent recruits whose bodies retained enough developmental plasticity to integrate the new organs without rejection. Aspirants underwent years of surgery and conditioning as each organ was implanted in sequence, their bodies gradually transforming as the gene seed reshaped them according to the template encoded in their Primarch's genetics. The process killed significant percentages of aspirants whose bodies proved incompatible with the modifications, but those who survived emerged as warriors far superior to the Thunder Warriors who had conquered Terra. The 20 legions took shape over the final years of the Unification Wars and the period immediately following Terra's consolidation. Each legion began with a few thousand Space Marines, their numbers growing as production facilities refined their techniques and expanded their capacity. The legions trained in the wastelands surrounding the Imperial Palace, their exercises preparing them for the campaigns they would fight once the Great Crusade began. The absence of their Primarchs meant that command structures developed differently than the Emperor had originally intended, with the most capable Space Marines rising to leadership positions based on merit and combat effectiveness, rather than inheriting authority from their gene fathers. The early legions displayed characteristics that reflected their Primarchs, design traits even without their gene fathers present to guide them. The First Legion demonstrated tactical flexibility and a capacity for independent operation that made them ideal for campaigns where communication with Terra might be delayed or impossible. The Fifth Legion showed affinities for rapid assault and overwhelming force application, their Space Marines naturally gravitating toward aggressive tactics that would later define their combat doctrine. The Seventh Legion exhibited tendencies toward siege warfare and defensive operations, their gene seed apparently encoding preferences that expressed themselves in how individual Space Marines approached tactical problems. These emergent characteristics suggested that the Primarch's influence over their legions would extend beyond simple genetic inheritance to encompass fundamental approaches to warfare and leadership. The Emperor understood that recovering the scattered Primarchs would become a priority once the Great Crusade began. His psychic abilities allowed him to sense his son's presences in the warp, though the distances involved and the Immaterium's turbulent nature prevented him from locating them precisely. He knew they lived and that they had survived their ejection from the gestation chambers, but determining which worlds they had landed on would require physically traveling to those systems and searching. The Great Crusade would serve dual purposes, both reunifying scattered human worlds under Imperial rule and providing opportunities to search for the missing Primarchs across the territories being brought into compliance. The warp storms that had isolated humanity for 5,000 years began their gradual recession during the final decades of the 30th millennium. The turbulence that had made interstellar travel suicidal slowly decreased to levels where skilled navigators could plot courses through the Immaterium with acceptable risks of arrival at intended destinations. The Emperor monitored these changes carefully, recognizing that the calming of the warp represented the opening of a window of opportunity that might not remain open indefinitely. Humanity needed to reunify and establish a strong presence across the galaxy before the warp's nature shifted again, before some new catastrophe isolated human worlds, or before alien species filled the power vacuum left by humanity's 5,000-year absence from galactic affairs. The final preparations for the Great Crusade involved logistical planning on scales that dwarfed anything humanity had previously attempted. The Imperium would need to project military force across thousands of light years, while simultaneously establishing the administrative infrastructure to govern millions of worlds. The Space Marine legions would serve as the tip of the spear, their superhuman capabilities allowing them to conquer worlds that conventional armies might struggle against for years. Imperial army regiments recruited from Terra, and the first compliant worlds would follow behind the Space Marines, providing garrison forces and occupation troops to hold territories once they had been conquered. The Mechanicum's Forge worlds would manufacture the weapons, armor, vehicles, and spacecraft needed to equip these forces, their production facilities operating at capacities that pushed the limits of what their ancient machinery could sustain. The Emperor's vision for the Imperium extended beyond mere military conquest to encompass a fundamental transformation of human society across the galaxy. The imperial truth that would be promulgated during the Great Crusade rejected all forms of religious belief, declaring that the universe operated according to natural laws that could be understood through reason and science rather than through appeals to supernatural entities. This atheistic philosophy aimed to protect humanity from chaos corruption by denying the chaos gods the worship and belief that sustained them. The Emperor understood that religion provided vectors for demonic influence, that populations who believed in gods and spirits could be more easily manipulated into serving the ruinous powers. An atheistic humanity that rejected supernatural explanations would be more resistant to corruption, or so the Emperor calculated based on his millennia of observation. The Administratum began taking shape as the bureaucratic apparatus that would manage the Imperium's vast territories. Scribes and administrators recruited from Terra's conquered kingdoms received training in record-keeping systems designed to track populations, resources, and compliance across millions of worlds. The organization developed standardized protocols for planetary assessment, taxation, and governance that would be imposed on every world brought into the Imperium regardless of local customs or preferences. This standardization would allow the Imperium to function despite the communication delays inherent in managing territories spanning the entire galaxy, with local administrators able to make decisions based on established guidelines rather than requiring approval from Terra for routine matters. The legions received their first assignments as the Great Crusade's launch approached, their orders directing them toward star systems that long-range surveys had identified as likely locations for surviving human populations. The First Legion would head toward the galactic northeast, their route taking them through regions where fragmentary astropathic signals suggested the presence of advanced human civilizations. The 13th Legion drew assignments in the galactic south, their campaigns intended to secure regions close to Terra before expanding outward. Other legions received similar orders, their deployment patterns designed to create an expanding sphere of imperial control radiating outward from humanity's birthworld. The Emperor prepared to lead the Great Crusade personally during its initial phases, his presence necessary to inspire the legions and to demonstrate that humanity's reunification represented a return to greatness rather than mere conquest by another warlord. He understood that many human worlds would resist integration into the Imperium, their populations having developed independent cultures and governments during the Age of Strife that they would be reluctant to surrender. The Emperor's reputation and the visible proof of his capabilities would be essential for convincing these worlds that compliance served their interests better than resistance. His psychic abilities would also prove crucial for combating chaos corruption wherever it was encountered, as only a being of his power could reliably banish greater demons or cleanse worlds that had fallen completely under the ruinous power's influence. The Astronomicon achieved operational status in the final years before the Great Crusade's launch, its psychic beacon beginning to shine through the warp and provide the navigational reference point that would make reliable interstellar travel possible across the entire galaxy. The device's activation required the Emperor to maintain a constant psychic connection to its mechanisms, channeling power that would be amplified and broadcast by the choir of psychers assembled to support it. The strain of maintaining this connection would prevent the Emperor from traveling far from Terra for extended periods, though during the Great Crusade's early decades, he could still lead campaigns personally while the Astronomicon operated at reduced intensity. The limitations this imposed on his mobility represented an acceptable trade-off for the navigational capabilities the beacon provided to Imperial fleets. The Great Crusade stood ready to begin as the 30th millennium drew toward its close. Terra had been unified under the Emperor's rule, its population mobilized for the massive undertaking ahead. The Space Marine legions had been created and trained, 20 forces of transhuman warriors ready to reconquer the galaxy in the name of humanity. The Mechanicum's forges produced weapons and equipment in quantities sufficient to equip the millions of soldiers who would serve in the Imperial Army. The Administratum had established the bureaucratic frameworks needed to govern the territories that would be brought into compliance. The Astronomicon burned bright, its light visible across the galaxy to those with the psychic sensitivity to perceive it. Humanity prepared to emerge from 5,000 years of isolation and fragmentation, ready to reclaim its place among the stars and forge an empire that would span the galaxy. The Emperor's plans, delayed but not destroyed by the scattering of the Primarchs, would finally begin their implementation. The Age of Strife had ended. The Age of Man was about to begin, and with it would come the Great Crusade, 2 centuries of warfare and conquest that would reshape the galaxy and determine humanity's fate for the next 10,000 years. The Emperor looked outward from Terra, toward the stars that humanity had once claimed and would claim again, his vision encompassing a future where humanity stood united against the darkness that threatened to consume it, strong enough to survive in a galaxy that had proven hostile to every previous civilization that had attempted to master it.